today is Cyber War, How Russian Hackers and Trolls Helped Elect the President by Kathleen Hall Jamieson. This is from the introduction. Imagine a strategy memo forecasting cyber attacks by Russian hackers, trolls, and bots designed to roil social discontent and damage the electoral process of a major party U.S. presidential nominee. Or, if she winds up winning, sabotage her ability to govern. Guaranteed payoff, no fingerprints, no keystroke record, no contrails in the cloud. To ensure that Americans would believe that disparaging messages about her were made in the U.S., use Bitcoin to buy space and set up virtual private networks on American servers. Distribute hacked content stolen from the accounts of her staff and associates through an intermediary, WikiLeaks. Use identity theft, stolen social security numbers, and appropriated IDs to circumvent Facebook and PayPal's demand for actual names, birth dates, and addresses. On platforms such as Instagram and Twitter, register under assumed names. Diffuse and amplify your attack and advocacy through posts on Facebook, tweets and retweets on Twitter, videos on YouTube, reporting and commentary on RT, blogging on Tumblr, news sharing on Reddit, and viral memes and jokes on 9gag. Add to the mix a video game called Hiltendo, in which a missile-trading Clinton figure vaporizes classified emails sought by the FBI. Employ online agitators and bots to upvote posts from imposter websites such as blackmattersus.com to the top of such subreddits as r/thedonald and r/Hillary for prison. Drive content to trend. To maximize the impact of your handiwork, use data analytics and search engine maximization tools built into social media platforms. To test and fuel doubts about the security of U.S. voter information, hack the electoral systems of the states. And throughout the primary and general elections season, seed the notion that if Hillary Clinton were to win, she would have done so by rigging the election, an outcome that would repay her assaults on the legitimacy of their leader's presidency with doubts about her own. Were she instead to lose, she would no longer be a thistle in the toned torso of the hackers and trolls' boss's likely boss. Every result but one produces a desirable outcome for the Kremlin. Outcome 1, Clinton is off the international stage. Outcome 2, she wins but can't govern effectively. Outcome 3, the former Secretary of State is elected and the country simply moves on, but the sabotage nonetheless has magnified cultural tensions and functions as a pilot from which to birth later success, perhaps when she runs for a second term. The only eventuality that damages the Russian cyber soldiers and their commander-in-chief is the fourth, in which, in real time, the cyber attackers are unmasked by a vigilant intelligence community, condemned by those in both major political parties and around the world, characterized by the media as spies and saboteurs. The Russian message is blocked or labeled as Russian propaganda, and when included in media accounts, the stolen content is relentlessly tied to its Russian origins and sources. None of that, however, happened. Instead, to the surprise of the Russian masterminds, as well as both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, he won the Electoral College, and with it a 4-year claim on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Although countrywide she bested him by almost 2.9 million votes, he unexpectedly captured an Electoral College majority by running the table. By the end of the evening of November 8th, Florida, as well as Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, were in his column. The ways in which Russian hacking and social media messaging altered the content of the electoral dialogue and thus contributed to Donald Trump's victory are the subjects of this book. To begin my exploration, this overview chapter will highlight key findings of the U.S. intelligence community, preview my focus on the hackers and trolls and the synergy between them, justify casting the Russian machinations as acts of cyber war, outline ways in which susceptibilities in our system of government and media structures magnified their effect, and note 5 presuppositions that will shape my analysis of the Russian trolls' work, and one that will guide my study of the effects of the hackers. Forming the backdrop for my inquiry are 3 reports on the Russian intervention of the 2016 presidential election. The October 7, 2016 statement jointly issued by the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence on Election Security. The January 2017 conclusion of the U.S. intelligence agencies, CIA, FBI, NSA, and the February 2018 Robert Mueller indictment of 13 of the Russians allegedly behind the social media intrusions. On a day that will live in campaign lore, as much for what didn't happen as what did, more on that in a moment, the first of the 3 revealed the following. The U.S. intelligence community is confident that the Russian government directed the recent compromises of email from U.S. persons and institutions, including the U.S. political organizations. The recent disclosures of alleged hacked emails on sites like DCLeaks.com and WikiLeaks and by the Guccifer 2.0 online persona are consistent with the methods and motives of Russian-directed efforts. These thefts and disclosures were intended to interfere with the U.S. election process.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Well, happy Thursday, although there's a sad moment here, more than a moment. Representative Elijah Cummings has passed away. He was born just 5 months before I was. I mean, you know, we're the same age. And this was a man who modeled integrity, who modeled service. He lived in his district, went home to his district every night, who modeled fearlessness, you know, as chairman of the House Oversight Committee, taking on Donald Trump and doing it, you know, just like a statesman. We're going to talk with his old friend, longtime friend, Joe Madison, in the third hour of our program, so we'll circle back around to that. In our second hour, Professor Richard Wolff is going to be with us. We're going to talk about this new apparent, you know, there's some inside information. Apparently, the grifter in the White House is making billions. Somebody, and we don't know who, but somebody is buying these highly leveraged stock devices. They're basically bets on movement in the stock market, but they're highly leveraged, where basically if you lose the bet, you lose everything that you put up. But if you win the bet, you win big. And whoever this is keeps buying these rather conspicuous chunks of this particular type of stock bet just before Donald Trump says things about how wonderful everything is with China, or we just reached a deal. In fact, in one case, he actually lied through his teeth. Just made it up. Yeah, we got 2 phone calls from China. There was a bet out there. That bet paid off, and as soon as the bet paid off, Trump was like, oh, no, I lied. So we're going to ask Richard Wolff about that. Also, we're discovering that Donald Trump had 2 sets of books. It's becoming quite clear, and New York City is investigating this. He had 1 set of books that showed that his companies were losing money, and therefore he shouldn't have to pay property taxes and other kinds of taxes. And then he had another set of books that he showed to bankers and investors and potential condo buyers, saying that he was making money hand over fist and things were wonderful. This is the definition of financial fraud. And we're going to get into that in our second hour with Professor Wolff as well. And as I mentioned in our third hour, Joe Madison is going to drop by. We're going to talk about Elijah Cummings. But in this first hour, I want to get into the Supreme Court because there's just like so much happening at this level. One of the circuit courts, I believe it was on September 23rd, and I think it was the Third Circuit, recently struck down ownership rules of radio stations. Some of the ownership rules, making it easier for billionaires to buy lots and lots of radio stations and put lots and lots of right-wing programming on them. I'm guessing probably a Trump judge. But it's just one example of, how basically the courts are running everything in this country. And so my question for this first hour is, I'll lay out the question first, then I'm going to lay out the argument, is how do we best reform the Supreme Court? Now, then comes the question, why do we need to reform the Supreme Court? And there's a really fundamental question here. And that is, do we live in and want to continue living in either a constitutionally limited representative democratic republic or a constitutionally limited monarchy, a semi-democratic monarchy? Now, in a monarchy, you've got somebody who is not elected by the people, who is not answerable to the people, typically the consequence of accidents of birth, right? The son of the previous king, or the daughter if there are no sons. as in the case of the Queen of England right now, or if a son decides to, step out of the line of succession or whatever. I mean, there's all these variations. But basically, somebody who's not elected to office, who has final say on everything, who can, shoot down laws, who can, dissolve parliament, things like that, who can decide who the leaders of the country are going to be. That's a monarchy. And that's a role that the Supreme Court filled in 2000 when they decided that George W. Bush would be the guy who would be in the White House. That's the role that the Supreme Court fills with almost every decision now, striking down, upholding, modifying, or rewriting laws in case after case after case. And this is a process called judicial review, using your interpretation or understanding of the Constitution to decide if you're going to allow a particular law which has been passed by Congress and signed by the president to stand. And there is arguably nowhere in the Constitution where the Supreme Court is given this power. It just doesn't happen. And in fact, in the early, it's just not there. I mean, in the early days when the whole issue was being debated, what are we going to have here? How is this going to be done? The Constitution was written in 1787. In 1788, Madison and Hamilton published this long series of newspaper articles to basically sell the Constitution. And I'm reading, this is from page 16 of my book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court. This is from the chapter, The Hidden History of Judicial Review. May 28, 1788, Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist, quote, and the problem was people were worried that the Supreme Court, would end up being a monarchical branch of government, that they would end up being basically in charge of everything. And he says, the judiciary is beyond comparison the weakest of the three departments of power. It can never attack with success either of the other two branches. Well, clearly that's no longer the case. He says, he's quoting Montesquieu, he says, of the three powers above mentioned, the judiciary is next to nothing. He said, this is Federalist 78, from the natural feebleness of the judiciary, it is in continual jeopardy of being overpowered, awed, or influenced by its coordinate branches. But then again, these voices, particularly people like George Mason, kept coming up and saying, and Patrick Henry, saying what would prevent the Supreme Court from rising up and taking over the country. And so in June of 1788, in Federalist 81, Alexander Hamilton addresses that. And he says, the argument, or rather suggestions upon which this charge is founded, in other words, the things that, like Patrick Henry was saying, the Supreme Court's going to be too powerful, are to this effect, that the authority of the proposed Supreme Court of the United States will be superior to that of the legislature. The power of construing the laws according to the spirit, and he has the word spirit in all caps, of the Constitution will enable the court to mold those laws into whatever shape it may think proper. And then, so he's quoting basically the argument against the Constitution, against the Supreme Court. And he says, this is unprecedented as it is dangerous. And then he goes on to speak right to it. He says, in the first place, there is not a syllable in this proposed Constitution, he says, in the plan under consideration, in the proposed Constitution, which directly, the word directly in all caps, empowers the national courts to construe the laws according to the spirit of the Constitution, or which gives them any greater latitude in this respect than may be claimed by the courts of every state. And, he goes on from there, and in fact, I could read a dozen more, but I'm not going to. So what happened? Well, up until 1803, the Supreme Court basically was the final court of appeals. I mean, they were a primary court for disputes between the states and stuff like that, but, their principal function was being the place where the buck stops. But in 1803, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, who was Thomas Jefferson's third cousin and bitter political enemy, which is why John Adams made him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court on his last day in office in March of 1800, as he was having to turn over the reins of power to Thomas Jefferson because Adams lost the election and Vice President Jefferson became President Jefferson. So 2 years later, Jefferson's third cousin and hated political enemy John Marshall strikes down part of the Judiciary Act of 1789. And by striking down a law passed by Congress and signed by the president, asserts that he, as Chief Justice and the Supreme Court, have the power, have a superior power to that of the White House, the presidency, and Congress. And Jefferson went nuts. He said, if this decision stands, the Constitution has become a suicide pact. Under this construction, the court is now a despotic branch of government. He wrote to Abigail Adams. He said, who was a friend of his at the time, even though he wasn't talking to her husband. He wrote to her and he said, under this, the Constitution has become a thing of wax to be molded in the hands of the judiciary. So, I mean, Marshall got his fingers burned. He didn't do this again for the rest of his career in a big way. No more judicial review. The next time it happened, the second time it happened in a really consequential way, was in 1856 when Chief Justice Roger Taney thought, I'll solve the slavery problem once and for all. And in a decision called Dred Scott v. Sanford, ruled that the federal laws that allowed for free states versus slave states were irrelevant, and that all over the entire United States, people of color had no rights. They were property. And that led us right to the Civil War. So those were the two times in the first basically 80 years of the history of the United States that the Supreme Court did this. Now the Supreme Court does it every session. They're doing it with the vast majority of all of their decisions. They started this process in the 1870s when the court was being bribed by the big railroad barons. And I say that literally bribed. I wrote a book about this called Unequal Protection. We've got the letters from Jay Gould, the railroad baron, to Stephen J. Field, the Supreme Court Justice from the Ninth Circuit of California, saying that he would sponsor him to run for president if he would rule in his way with regard to corporate personhood and all this stuff. So the court started being bought off in the 1870s, 1880s, and that's when they started doing this all the time. And now we've got a court that has been packed by Mitch McConnell and a series of Republican presidents committing treason to get into the White House, and that treason being accepted and embraced by right-wing think tanks and billionaires because they knew it would get them their people on the court. So how do we change the court? How do we fix the court now that this corruption has happened?
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And how do we even begin the discussion with the American people about whether we want to live in a constitutional democracy or a monarchy? Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. So I just a little bit more of this, where what's his name? Alexander Hamilton is, going on and on and on. Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution says, in all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, and those in which a state shall be party, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. So the Supreme Court is the place where all those kind of things start. Disputes among the states, disputes between a state and the federal government, disputes between the federal government and other governments, and certain kinds of maritime law. In all the other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction. In other words, they're the final court of appeal, both as to law and fact, with such exceptions, and the word exceptions is capitalized in the Constitution, with such exceptions and under such regulations as the Congress shall make. So, Congress has the ability to say, no, wait a minute, Supreme Court, you can't do that. That's the exceptions. You can't rule on this. And with regard to regulations, to say, okay, we got 9 people on the court right now. Let's go to 10. Let's go to 12. Let's go to 15. Things like that. I'll go through some of the things that we can do with the court in just a minute. But just back to Hamilton. He says, we have seen that the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court would be confined to two classes of causes, and those of a nature to occur rarely. That's arguments between the states and treaties with other nations. In all other cases of federal cognizance, the original jurisdiction would appertain to the inferior tribunals. In other words, everything has to start with the lower court. And the Supreme Court would have nothing more than, now keep in mind, this is Alexander Hamilton selling the Constitution in Federalist number 81. And the Supreme Court would have nothing more than appellate jurisdiction, quote, with such exceptions and under such regulations as the Congress shall make, end quote. And then in the next sentence, Hamilton, essentially repeats himself and says, let me just double down on this. To avoid all inconveniences, it will be safest to declare generally that the Supreme Court shall possess appellate jurisdiction both as to law and fact, and that this jurisdiction shall be subject to such exceptions and regulations as the national legislature may prescribe. This will enable the rest of government to modify it in such a manner that it will best answer the ends of public justice and security. Yeah, in Federalist number 78, he says, nor does this conclusion by any means suppose a superiority of the judicial to the legislative power. It only supposes that the power of the people is superior to both, and that where the will of the legislator declared in his statutes stands in opposition to that of the people declared in the Constitution, the judges ought to be governed by the latter rather than the former. In other words, public opinion. In other words, our elected officials should be the ones making the decisions about what is and what isn't constitutional. I'll pick up this line of thought in just a moment. 22 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Talk media for the sane among us. Any lawyers out there want to argue judicial review with me? I'm ready. We'll be right back. So people say to me, well, Tom, if the Supreme Court doesn't have the final say in what is and what isn't constitutional, who does? One of his colleagues, I think it was George Mason, I don't recall specifically, wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson essentially saying just this. And by the way, this is super relevant for right now. We are facing a constitutional crisis right this minute, a number of them actually. And the Supreme Court is going to end up having final say in a lot of these things, including all these laws. Things like they tore apart Obamacare. They tore apart the Civil Rights Act. Who gave them that authority? They took it themselves. In my opinion, the Constitution does not give them that authority. So anyhow, people say, well, what if Congress and the president passed a law saying if you say something disrespectful of Donald Trump, you go to jail? That's unconstitutional, isn't it? Wouldn't you want the court to prevent that from happening? And my answer is, hey, that's already happened. In 1798, John Adams was president, Jefferson was vice president. Adams got passed the Alien and Sedition Act, which said that it was a crime to, quote, bring the president into disrepute, end quote. And on the day that John Adams signed that law, Thomas Jefferson, by the way, left town that day, and that was the last time he ever talked to John Adams in any consequential way. That was the end of their relationship until much later in their lives. And Adams, the first thing Adams did was he had Ben Franklin's grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bach, arrested and thrown in prison, his newspaper taken away from him and shut down, his home taken away from him, for writing an op-ed in which he said that President Adams was old, toothless, querulous, an old word that means cranky, and balding. Adams shut down 20 different newspapers. Did the Supreme Court say, wait a minute, John Adams, that's unconstitutional? No. The people did. And this is what, when Mason wrote this letter to Jefferson and said, okay, if the Supreme Court isn't the arbiter of what's constitutional, who is? Jefferson said the people themselves. which is the title of a book by Larry Kramer, the former dean of the Stanford Law School, which is a critique of judicial review. And it's absolutely brilliant. If you're an attorney or you're into this kind of stuff, it's a great book to read. Although I think I've written a pretty good one too here. And that's what happened in the election of 1800. People were so horrified by the fact that John Adams was throwing people into prison for disagreeing with him. Literally, the town drunk in Newark, New Jersey, Luther Baldwin, made a comment to a bartender about John Adams, and he got thrown in prison for it. Matthew Lyon, the congressman from Vermont, Adams threw him into prison. And what happened in the election of 1800? The people rose up and they swept out the Federalists and replaced the House, the Senate, and the White House. All came under the control of the Democratic Party. It was then called the Democratic Republican Party. The people themselves. And people say, well, that was back then. What about now? Well, President Woodrow Wilson passed a very similar law and started putting people like me in prison who were saying we should not go into World War I. Literally, President Wilson was imprisoning people for speaking out against World War I. And it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, that's fine. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt put Japanese in internment camps. The Karamazov decision went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, oh, we're good with that. The Supreme Court is not your savior. People say, well, what about Brown v. Board? In Brown v. Board, the Supreme Court was only reversing their own decision in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1898. They were undoing their own damage. So what do we do?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
I will lay out a few possibilities when we come back from the break, including one that I think is going to catch your hair on fire, particularly when you find out who it came from, right after this. Welcome to the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Settlers, The Mythology of the White Proletariat, The True Story of the White Nation by J. Sakai, published by Morningstar Press in 1989. This is from Chapter 2, The Foundations of Settler Life. The life of European settlers and the class structure of their society was abnormal because it was dependent upon a foundation of conquest, genocide, and enslavement. The myth of the self-sufficient white settler family clearing the wilderness and supporting themselves through their own initiative and hard labor is a propaganda fabrication. It is the absolute characteristic of settler society to be parasitic, dependent upon the super-exploitation of oppressed peoples for its style of life. Never has Euro-American society completely supported itself. This is the decisive factor in the consciousness of all classes and strata of white society from 1600 to now. Settler society was raised up above the level of backward old Europe by a foundation of conquest. This conquest was a miracle drug for a Europe convulsed with the reaction of decaying feudalism and deadly capitalism. Shot into the veins of the Spanish feudal nation, for instance, the miracle drug of the New World conquest gave Spain the momentary power to overrun North Africa, Holland, and Italy before her historical incident waned. Like many such fixes for Euro-Americans, this conquest was addicting. It was habit-forming and rapidly indispensable, not only culturally, but in the mechanism of an oppressor society whose lifeblood was new conquest. We'll examine this later in the relationship of settlerism to imperialism. For now, it's enough to see that this conquest is a material act of great magnitude, an economic and social event as important as the emergence of the factory system or the exploitation of petroleum in the Middle East. We stress the obvious here because the Euro-American settlers have always made light of their invasion and occupation, although the conquered territory is the precondition for their whole society. Traditionally, European settler societies throw off the propaganda smoke screens that they didn't really conquer and dispossess other nations. They claim with false modesty that they merely moved into vacant territory. So the early English settlers depicted America as empty, a howling wilderness, unsettled, sparsely populated, just waiting with a vacant sign on the door for the first lucky civilization to walk in and claim it. Theodore Roosevelt wrote defensively in 1900, quote, The settler and pioneer have at bottom had justice on their side. This great continent could not have been kept as nothing but a game preserve for squalid savages, end of quote. It is telling that this lie is precisely the same lie put forward by white Afrikaner settlers who claim that South Africa was literally totally uninhabited by any Africans when they arrived from Europe. To universal derision, these European settlers claim to be the only rightful historic inhabitants of South Africa. Or we can hear similar defenses put forward by the European settlers of Israel, who claim that much of the Palestinian land and buildings they occupy are rightfully theirs, since the Arabs had allegedly decided to voluntarily abandon it all during the 1948-49 war. Are these kinds of tales any less preposterous than those put forward by Euro-American settlers? America was spacious and sparsely populated only because the European invaders destroyed whole civilizations and killed off millions of Native Americans to get the land and profits they wanted. We all know that when the English arrived at Virginia, for example, they encountered an urban, village-dwelling society far more skilled than they were in the arts of medicine, agriculture, fishing, and government. This civilization was reflected in a chain of 300 Indian nations and peoples stretching from the Arctic Circle to the tip of South America, many of whom had highly developed societies. There was, in fact, a greater population in these Indian nations in 1492 than in all of Western Europe. Recent scholarly estimates indicate that at the time of Columbus, there were 100 million Indians in the hemisphere, 10 million in North America, 25 million in Central Mexico, and an additional 65 million elsewhere in Central and South America. These numbers have long been concealed since they give rise to the logical question of what happened to this great mass of people. The European invaders, Spanish, Dutch, English, Portuguese, and French, simply killed off millions and millions to safeguard their conquest of the land and provide the disposable slave labor they needed to launch their new world. Conservative Western historical estimates show that the Spanish reduced, in quotes, the Indian population of their colonies from some 50 million to only 4 million by the end of the 17th century. And from the 10 million Indians who once inhabited North America, after 4 centuries of settler invasion and rule, there were in 1900 perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 surviving descendants in the United States. This was the very substantial down payment towards the continuing blood price that third world nations have to pay to sustain the Euro-American way of life. So when we hear that the settlers pushed out the Indians or forced the Indians to leave their traditional hunting grounds, we know that these are just code phrases to refer politely to the most barbaric genocide imaginable. It could well be the greatest crime in all of human history. Only here, the Adolf Eichmanns and Heinrich Himmlers had names like Benjamin Franklin and Andrew Jackson. The point is that genocide was not an accident, not an excess, not the unintended side effect of virile European growth. Genocide was the necessary and deliberate act of the capitalists and their settler shock troops. The book Settlers. So what do we do with a Supreme Court that is out of control? Franklin Roosevelt faced this. Actually, the country faced the possibility of this after Lincoln was assassinated. In fact, let's just go back. One of the ways there's 2 things in the Constitution, Article 3, Section 2, about what you can do with the court. One is you can regulate it. The other is you can create exceptions to what the Supreme Court may do. So let's take these one at a time. The regulated part. Typically the way Congress regulates the Supreme Court is by determining how many members it has. Congress can also determine when it meets, where it meets, what its budget is, and can even prescribe rules for it, like ethics rules, which I think would be a really, really good idea. Passing a law that says the Supreme Court has to comply with the Federal Code of Ethics for federal judges. The Supreme Court is exempt from the Federal Code of Ethics, which is why Thomas and Scalia were able to go to all these Koch brothers events and get paid big speaking fees and get feted at 5-star resorts like the one, the hunting retreat where Scalia died, things like that. So, an ethics thing. But when Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson, a slaveholder and Southerner, became president. Lincoln's biggest mistake, putting this guy on the ticket with him for his second term. And Congress, which at the time there were 10 members of the Supreme Court, and Congress was so horrified by the possibility that Andrew Johnson might appoint somebody to the Supreme Court that they immediately met and passed a law reducing the number of members of the court to 6, so that up to 4 people could die before Andrew Johnson would have a chance to put somebody on the court. Andrew Johnson lost the election in 1868. Ulysses Grant became president. In 1869, when Congress met, they got together and they said, okay, that's it. We're going to take the court back up to 9 people, which is where it is right now. So they nakedly, for purely political purposes, changed the number of members of the Supreme Court. Then in 1937, from 33 to 36, the first term of Franklin Roosevelt's administration, Congress kept passing great laws, child labor laws, minimum wage laws, right to unionize law, just a whole series of really great pieces of legislation. And the Supreme Court was knocking down almost every single one of them. So he wins re-election in 36. He gets re-inaugurated in 37. And the Social Security Act is coming before the Supreme Court. And the word is that they're going to strike it down as unconstitutional. Just like they struck down child labor laws as unconstitutional. Just like they struck down the minimum wage law as unconstitutional. And so Franklin Roosevelt says, I'm going to propose legislation that will say that all of the justices on the court who are over 70 years old, collectively, they'll still be on the court. The Constitution doesn't say you can kick them off the court. Federal judges have their jobs for life. They'll still be on the court, but they will have one vote among them. They will be justices emeritus if they're over 70. And there were 5 of them on the court at the time who were over 70. And then I will replace the missing 4 votes by adding 4 new members to the court. It was called a court packing scheme. If you read the Wikipedias and things of today, everybody says, it's so unpopular, FDR took so much flack for that. In actual point of fact, if you read the histories, as I quote my book, that were written in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s by people who were actually there, it was very popular. There was a very good chance that Franklin Roosevelt would have gotten this through Congress. It had a lot of public support. And the only reason he didn't need to go forward was because Justice Owens and Justice Roberts, in response to public pressure, frankly, changed their votes. They started voting with Franklin Roosevelt. And that put an end to the court packing scheme. And then FDR, replaced, I believe, every single person on the court. Maybe there was one he didn't, but I think he replaced the entire court over the course of his 4 terms in office. And so you had a relatively moderate court going into the Eisenhower administration and the Kennedy administration as a result of that. And then, Nixon committed treason and became president and started packing the court. So one thing that we could do is actually change the makeup of the court. And Elizabeth Warren has suggested this. Say, okay, we're going to go to 13 justices now, and I'm going to be putting some on. Or we're going to stagger when they go on and when they go off, and then we'll move them off the Supreme Court back into the federal bench, which is okay with the Constitution. And so every president will get to appoint 1 or 2 or something like that. I mean, there's these plans to reorganize the court. That's one possibility. The other is something that a young lawyer was given the job by Ronald Reagan to figure out back in the early 1980s. Reagan was swept into power by a Supreme Court decision in 1976, Buckley, and then in 1978, First National Bank. These 2 decisions opened the floodgates to billionaire and corporate money for federal office. And so in 1979 and 1980, just gobs of cash flowed into the Republican Party and made Ronald Reagan president, in addition to cutting a deal with Iran to hold the hostages and make Jimmy Carter look weak. And as that money came in, Reagan, a couple of Reagan's campaign promises were that he was going to reverse Brown versus Board of Education, the 1954 decision that said segregation is illegal. He was going to reverse that. And he was going to reverse Roe v. Wade, the 1973 decision that gave women the right to have an abortion. Now, in some states, women already had that right. In other states, they didn't. And, there's a whole kind of thing here. But he said, we're going to reverse these 2 decisions. So he hired this young lawyer, brought him into the Justice Department, said, here's your desk, here's your office. You got a year to figure this thing out. This lawyer did a deep dive into the founders, into Hamilton's writings, Jefferson's writings, the Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention, the history of the Supreme Court, the history of judicial review throughout the years, and ended up writing a 29-page memo that was like a small nuclear bomb going off in the Reagan administration. And what he said, what this young lawyer said was, according to the Constitution, Congress can create exceptions to what the Supreme Court may do, what they may rule on. So all we have to do is have Congress pass a law saying that segregation of schools is, in fact, legal, and states may, in fact, pass laws forbidding abortion, effectively overturning Brown and Roe. And then the last sentence of that law has to be something to the effect of, and this law may not be reviewed by the Supreme Court. He said, just write that into the law. It has been done in states over the years. It's called jurisdiction stripping or court stripping. It has, and it's actually been done in some federal laws, have been written with that clause in them, but they were never controversial things. Tom Daschle, when he was Senate Majority Leader, got language similar to this in one of the farm bills, according to Phyllis Schlafly. But, it was never litigated. Now, the decision that the Reagan administration came down to after this young lawyer came up with this whole long memo and said, just do this, the decision that they made was that, doing such a thing would be a political bomb going off. And it would set up a battle between the legislative branch, which the Republicans controlled then, and the executive branch as their ally, and on one hand, and on the Supreme Court on the other. I mean, the Supreme Court could say, wait a minute, we're going to rule that your law is unconstitutional. Your law saying that we don't have the power to rule on something. And they felt like they didn't have a large enough majority in the House and Senate to take on the Supreme Court like that. And so it never went anywhere. It just sat in a drawer until I found it last year. That young lawyer, by the way, that Reagan hired, who came up with this idea about here's how you neuter the Supreme Court, his name was John Roberts. He is right now the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. He's the guy who went down to Florida in 2000 when he was clerking for Rehnquist, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and advised the Republicans, along with another young lawyer named Brett Kavanaugh, advised the Republicans on how to put together their arguments before the Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore to stop the recount in Florida, which had it been completed, and we know this because the votes actually got counted a year later up in New York, where they took semi trucks took all the ballots up to New York and hand counted them. It took a whole year. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Associated Press, and Gannett did it. And what they found was that Al Gore won Florida, period, by any measure. But in any case, John Roberts, helped advise them on how to argue this thing before. I mean, this guy, he's a serious political player. So there's a few ways that we can get the Supreme Court under control. There's whether it's packing the court, whether it's, start with simple stuff, judicial ethics. Essentially create term limits saying, okay, you serve on the court for 15 years, and then after that, you go back to being a federal judge in whatever circuit you came from. You go back to the Third Circuit or the Fifth Circuit or the D.C. Circuit. That's all completely constitutional, easily done. But there's this fundamental argument. Hang on.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
This fundamental argument, do we want to continue to live in a constitutional monarchy, or do we want to go back to being a democratic republic? And welcome back. Let's see here. Rhoda in Portland, Michigan. Hey, Rhoda, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I have an answer to the question what to do with a Supreme Court that's out of control.
Okay.
Hold a nationwide referendum on major issues. We, the people, will vote for or against major issues. For example, bans on assault weapons, women's issues, and the like. In that way, we, the people, will have the pure control without ethical problems. We, the people, nationwide. Do it in other countries. Why not here?
It's a great suggestion, Rhoda. And right now the thing that there's two problems with this idea. The first is some states, about half the states, have this built into their constitutions, and they were almost all states that came into the Union after 1880, when the railroads and the steel companies and whatnot started corrupting politicians. And so this was a way of getting around a corrupt state legislature, was have the people themselves vote on things. So most of your western states, most of the states that became states after 1880, have written into their constitution the provision for this. And but the United States Constitution doesn't. So there's no constitutional mechanism for what you're describing, outside of the national referendum that we have every 2 years by voting for Congress, or every 4 years by voting for president. The other problem is one that I watched in real time living here in Portland. We're in Oregon. Louise and I live in Oregon, but we're right next door to Vancouver, Washington. It's just on the other side of the Columbia River. And it's one of the larger cities in Washington state. And so we get, our local TV is both the Washington market and the Portland market. And Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington State has a referendum provision in their constitution, like you're describing. And he proposed a carbon tax, very simple carbon tax, very small carbon tax. And the fossil fuel companies hired this guy who used to be the Republican Attorney General or Secretary of State. I think he was Secretary of State for Washington State. A very nice looking guy. He looks like Mr. Rogers. He talks like Mr. Rogers. He's wearing a sweater on television, sweater vest, and I just want to share with you a few problems I have. We all applaud Governor Inslee's concern about the climate and carbon. But this is going to destroy the economics of our state. This is going to take thousands of dollars every year out of the pockets of working families. This is going to ruin our economy. There are better ways to do this than than this brute force method that Governor Inslee's trying. And these were all lies, by the way. I mean, just lying through their teeth. And that ad ran, if you watched MSNBC or CNN, that ad ran 2 or 3 times an hour, every hour, all day, every day for 2 weeks up to that election. And sure enough, a ballot provision that had 80% popular support when it was first offered ended up at the end of that legislative, or when the vote actually happened, ended up losing. The no vote was in the 60s, as I recall, high 50s or in the 60%. So that's the other problem. And what made that possible? The Supreme Court. In the Buckley decision, the First National Bank decision, and the Citizens United decision, the Supreme Court basically said, if fossil fuel companies want to run ads on TV and lie to people, that's protected for First Amendment free speech. So that's the other problem with the referendums right now that we've got to solve, and it's a problem, again, that was created by the Supreme Court. But, Rhoda, I love the way you're thinking.
Civics in school.
Yeah.
We need to teach civics in school.
Amen. We need to teach civics in school. Amen. Rhoda, thank you. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Connie in Shady Grove, Oregon. Hey, Connie, what's up?
PBS had a special the other night on the Supreme Court, and they talked about the Federal Society.
Federalists,
and there's about Federalists. There's about 5 of them that come out of there on the Supreme Court.
That's correct.
And McConnell, I don't know, it scared me to death. McConnell has a lot of power.
Yeah, we used to vet Supreme Court nominees through the American Bar Association. And the Republicans stopped doing that, and they started vetting them through the Federalist Society, which was created by the Koch brothers and a few other cranky right-wing billionaires back in the 70s to basically find promising young law school students and turn them into right-wing crazies. and then get them on federal benches and state benches for that matter. And they're doing it. And you're absolutely right. This is a horror show, Connie.
Yes.
And that's why I'm saying it's time for us to talk about, the title of the chapter in my book where I quote John Roberts' memo at some length. It's why I think it's not the last chapter, but the next to the last chapter. And the title of the chapter is "In Case of Emergency, Break Glass." I mean, this is something that has not been done in 240 years, but maybe we need to consider doing it because that's how bad things are getting. And so, yeah. Anyway, Connie, I need to move along, but thank you for the call and thanks for weighing in. Ronald in Chicago. Hey, Ronald, thoughts on the Supreme Court?
Hello, Tom. How are you?
Good. What's up?
I've called before on this, and what I really think. First of all, our selection process is crazy. Why should we have the majority party in the Senate make all confirmations on Supreme Court justices and appellate court justices anyway?
Right.
Why not a committee of both parties with input from the citizens of this country, so we can truly have of the people, by the people, for the people?
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant, Ronald. I mean, putting together judicial commissions the way that California did their reapportionment commissions, that determine congressional boundaries, and you have basically a group of people who are academics who are not, partisans. Making these decisions. The reason, by the way, the Constitution is written the way it is, the reason why it goes through the Senate is the Senate was not elected by the people at the time, and neither was the President. The President and isn't today. Now we have direct election of the Senate, and we have since, I think, 1917. But the President is still elected by the Electoral College. And the idea was there were people among the founders. I mean, this was a big debate at the founding of the Republic. Shall we be essentially a democratic or a constitutional monarchy, or shall we be a constitutional democratic republic? And those people who were in favor of monarchy, essentially, were saying, the courts need to be completely independent. The most independent bodies in Congress will be the Senate, which is, the senators are picked by the individual states, and the president, who's picked by the Electoral College. They're the least likely to be buffeted by the winds of public opinion. So they're the most likely to be nonpartisan and thoughtful and respectful of law and precedent, which is what you're talking about, Ronald, and spot on. And thank you for the suggestion. But, unfortunately, that's not how it worked out, and the Senate got corrupted, and the Senate has become partisan, and now the court has become corrupted by the Federalist Society and by the Republican Party and by this. And, yeah, absolutely. Mike in Lomita, California. Hey, Mike, what's up?
Yeah, I just called up with a little quibble about terminology. In modern political science, terminology of constitutional monarchy is like what we have in Northern Europe and not like what the framers might have imagined.
You're right.
But,
you're right.
I would
in modern
like
terms.
To.
But if I can insert, Mike, there are still some constitutional monarchies in Europe where the monarch can strike down laws. Most of them, the monarch can't strike down the law. There are some, in Germany, they have a special Supreme Court in addition to their Supreme Court that only does constitutional evaluation. It meets very rarely, very, very rarely. And in the Netherlands, the Supreme Court does not have the power of judicial review. So back to you.
The titular executive doesn't have the power to strike down laws anywhere in Europe that I'm aware of. But as long as we have a Senate where 10 cows have as much political authority as I do, this whole problem will not go away.
Yeah, I agree. So what's your solution for solving the Supreme Court problem? Because this is going to be a crisis, I guarantee you, for the next president. If you get President Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or even President Joe Biden trying to expand Medicare or trying to take on, the Republican voter, games that are going on, like in Ohio, where the head of the Ohio League of Women Voters discovered that her name was on the 200,000 people that Ohio was going to purge from the voting list, a month before the elections. She's pissed off and fighting back, but the Republicans in Ohio are still like, hey, we're going to these 200,000 people. They just happen to be in Democratic districts, but we're going to take them off the voting rolls. So what do you do?
All the solutions you've mentioned are viable, but before we can get any of them through, we have to get control of the Senate and the White House.
Yeah, absolutely. In a big way. Yeah. Thank you very much. Spot on. Jamie in Benton Harbor, Michigan. Hey, Jamie, what's up?
How you doing?
Good. What's on your mind?
Well, I heard you talking earlier. I was watching on YouTube. I've watched it a couple of times. Well, I heard you on YouTube talking about the settlers of this land. And I wanted to talk about the true owners of the land, the people that were already here when the settlers came here. This story, when I usually hear the story about the settlers comes out, I don't really hear that the reality is that the true people of the land were black people.
Jamie, this is not the topic that we're discussing today at all. I'm sorry. William in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Hey, William, what's up? William? No. Okay, let's try Joseph in New York City, listening on WBAI. Hey, Joseph.
Yes, good afternoon, Tom.
Hey, we have a little less than a minute, by the way, Joseph.
Now, you're talking about if somebody doesn't respond to the House of Representatives subpoena. Suppose I'm one of the Koch brothers. What's to stop me from giving them huge speaking fees for talking once a week for about an hour and making up every penny that you've withheld from these guys, making it even better? I'll even hire than the dopey nephew.
Yeah.
Well,
or what happens if this goes to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court says, you don't have to, or you do have to, but here, yeah. And just going after people with money. I agree with you, Joseph. I don't think that that's the way that we want to do it. This whole impeachment hearing thing is going to get real interesting. Sondland, I guess is his name, is testifying right now. We will find out probably by the end of his testimony whether the president specifically, whether Donald Trump specifically, told him we're going to go after Ukraine. We're going to withhold $400 million of the military services until they give us dirt on Joe Biden. I mean, if that comes out, it's like, it's essentially already out. We heard the transcript. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment by yours truly. This is from Chapter 1, The Unholy Alliance of Racism, Genocide, and Guns. In Isaiah 14:21, the Lord tells Isaiah, "Prepare for his sons a place of slaughter because of the iniquity of their fathers." It's a variation on the old story of karma and seems in a very real way to be playing out today in the United States. America is facing an epidemic. Public health officials use that word of gun-related suicides, accidents, and even homicides and police killings. That epidemic has grown worse in the past decade, largely because the number of guns in America has increased, in large part because of the racial fears of white men who have bought guns in record numbers for 8 years during the time in office of America's first black president. A landmark 1999 study from researchers Franklin Zimring and Gordon Hawkins showed that the main correlation, far surpassing mental illness, socioeconomic status, or race, that could be defined as causal in predicting the rates of gun deaths is a simple number: the number of guns distributed among society. In the 30 years since that study, Zimring and Hawkins' results have been replicated and reanalyzed dozens of times. As the American Academy of Pediatrics said in a release published in AAAS's Science magazine, quote, "New research shows dramatic differences in the number of children hospitalized and killed each year in the U.S. from firearm-related injuries based on their state's gun legislation, even after adjusting for poverty, unemployment, and education rates. It found twice as many pediatric firearm deaths in states with the most lenient gun regulations compared to states where gun laws are strictest, end quote. They added that this is a critical issue for children, quoting Stephanie Cho, MD, the lead author of the abstract, quote, firearm-related injuries are the second leading cause of death among children in the United States. But we found a clear discrepancy in where those deaths happen that corresponds with the strengths of states' firearm legislation. In states with lenient laws, children die at alarmingly greater rates, end quote. And unsurprisingly, America not only has unusually lenient gun laws, but also has more guns in civilian hands than any other country in the world. America has a bit more than 4% of the world's population, but holds almost 50% of all the guns in civilian hands worldwide, more than 390 million guns. And the more guns a society has, the more gun deaths it will experience. The NRA and their army of lobbyists have been quite successful in making this happen. During Obama's presidency, there was a steady and hysterical drumbeat of articles, emails, and political proclamations by so-called pro-gun politicians and think tanks, suggesting that Obama was preparing to take away everyone's guns at any minute. There was even a subtext embraced by the hard right that he wasn't going to stop there. After disarming white Americans, these folks said, Obama was going to intern them in otherwise unused FEMA camps. Flipped-out gun owners were repeatedly arrested during the Obama years trying to break into retired or temporarily vacant military facilities and toxic waste sites, looking for evidence to prove that Obama was, in fact, preparing the modern-day version of the World War II-era Japanese internment camps. White supremacy was the founding notion of this nation. White Europeans thought themselves so superior to the human beings they met here in 1492 that Columbus himself became the first North American slaver, shipping Taino Indians back to Spain as slaves to the royal family. A slave is as good as gold, Columbus wrote for the king and queen. Europeans in the Americas then stepped up that game into a hemisphere-wide campaign of racial genocide, pulling off the largest multi-generational mass murder in the history of the world. In the midst of that effort, they also created the legal mechanisms necessary to define and legally regulate slavery, and even built those systems into America's founding document, the Constitution. America was birthed in slavery and genocide, and both needed guns. It was the superior weaponry of guns that gave the European settlers a massive advantage over the bow and arrow-equipped Native Americans, and it was the raw power of widespread white ownership of guns in the South that propped up the institution of slavery for hundreds of years. Without guns, neither would have been possible, or at least neither would have been as easy as they were to pull off. And now, after centuries of guns being used to kill off and keep down people of color in America, those same guns are creating a terrifying epidemic of gun-facilitated violence, from public schools to private homes and public concerts. It's enough to make one think that Isaiah was onto something. Chapter 2, The Sanitized History of America. The United States' expansion and conquest in the late 18th century through the 19th century and into the 20th century is a history written by white men, inked in the blood of Native Americans, and built on the broken and bloody backs of enslaved people brought here from Africa. From 1791, when the Bill of Rights went into effect, until the end of the Civil War, the Second Amendment protected the rights only of white men to own guns. This is simply because until the ratification of the 14th Amendment, states determined who was recognized as a person protected under the Constitution. Initially, in most states, that meant that white men who owned land and paid taxes were the only people considered full citizens under the Constitution. In the South, white men with guns formed slave patrols to control slaves and formed posses to hunt escaped slaves. The book, The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Declining power. The book, The Russia Trap.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. 6 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you. And we've been talking about the Supreme Court and judicial review and what do we do? How do we deal with an out-of-control court system that has been essentially bought and paid for and packed by right-wing billionaire interests? We'll continue that conversation as we go through the program. But speaking of, controlled and hacked and everything else, Donald Trump just announced, actually Mick Mulvaney just announced on his behalf as acting chief of staff, that the G7, which is going to be in June of this year, will be held at Trump's Doral Resort. He says, Trump says, it's not about me, it's about getting the right location. Yeah, great parking. So we've got this grifter in the White House, and on top of this, there's this amazing story in Vanity Fair about how somebody keeps, right before Donald Trump makes loud and sometimes shocking statements about, I'm about to cut a deal with China, or the deal with China just fell apart, or no, the deal with China's back on. These are market-moving statements. And before he says these things, somebody is buying, in one case, $1.5 billion worth of bets on the market moving based on what the president is going to say. And we don't know who it is or how it's being paid off. But this, I wanted to get Professor Richard Wolff on and talk about this. This is not quite macroeconomics, but it's certainly the intersection of economics, politics, and law. Professor Richard Wolff is the co-founder of Democracy at Work, the website democracyatwork.info. His website, rdwolf with 2fs.com, rdwolf.com. He's the author most recently of Understanding Marxism. Dr. Wolff, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
So could you explain to us what is going on and if there is, a history to this kind of thing being done by people in the know in politics and what the consequences of it might be? What's going on here?
Absolutely. This is an old problem. It sometimes goes by the name of insider trading, which is a broad term covering a multitude of sins. But the basic idea is the stock market is supposed to be a place where everybody who buys and sells securities has access to the same information, that there is nobody in a position to have information not generally available and then can buy or sell based on that. That's not supposed to happen. And it is punishable by law. If you are caught using information not generally accessible, you can be imprisoned, you can be fined, etc. Notwithstanding that, it would take a large army to catch all the people that are in a position to do that. They are people who work in or close to corporations who have the inside track on knowing what the plans of those corporations are before the public does. So if you know, for example, that Corporation X is finally decided it's going to build a new factory in, I'll just pick something as an example, Denver, Colorado, you are aware of that because your sister or brother or you yourself are on the board of directors or the planning department of that corporation. You are now not supposed to trade on that inaccessible information to the public. But of course, it's easy to have someone in your family or your friends go and buy real estate close to where the factory will be built, buy shares of stock in the company if you have reason to believe that once the expansion is announced, people are going to think well about that company and buy its shares on the stock market. So now we come to Mr. Trump. People in the know in the government, in Washington, around the White House, they know, at least the hypothesis is they know, that President Trump is likely to say one of his news-breaking things, because he's an expert at it, he does it all the time, and either China will go up, or China will go down, or Canada will go up, or a Huawei corporation will go down, or somebody will be sanctioned, or the Turks will be turned around, or whatever. And if you know that, even if you only know it an hour or two before the public, you can go in and either buy or sell securities, borrow them, have an arrangement with someone that you deliver shares at a certain date in the future at a certain time, knowing that you can do that by buying them tomorrow after the bad news is out at a very low price and passing them on to the person you've contracted with at the initial agreed higher price. The deals you can make are extraordinary, and the Vanity Fair article cites several examples in which people made, and this is important, tens of millions, in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars, literally in a matter of hours, by trading on that inside information. And so the question comes, given Mr. Trump's use of his office for all the other self-serving commercial interests, could there be someone in his circle, he or anybody in his family or anybody in his wider circle of friends, who gets a tip a few minutes beforehand and is then able to carry out one of these trades? And all it does is add more to that concept of the stock market that goes by the name casino capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, there's this one, they say, this was the day that Trump had just arrived in Japan. He was about to meet with President Xi of China. And somebody bought 420,000 September E-minis in the last 30 minutes of trading. This is June 28th. That was 40% of the day's trading volume in the September E-minis, making it a trade that would be hard to ignore. Trump goes into the meeting, comes out, and announces to the world that the trade talks are back on track. And the next sentence in the article, whoever bought the 420,000 E-minis on June 28 made a handsome profit of nearly $1.8 billion. Now,
right. And people should understand, they made that literally in a period of hours after they bought those things. And the only thing that moved the market was the statement by Mr. Trump. Had those people known that Mr. Trump was likely to make some such of a statement, this would have been a riskless investment. It couldn't go down if he did nothing. It could only go up if he did what in fact he did. So, of course, this is going to happen on a mammoth scale, because if you can earn that much plus and the risk is minimal, it's just too attractive for stock market hustlers to not do.
Yeah. So who enforces this? Is this the Securities Exchange Commission, the SEC?
Basically, that's right. That's their job to oversee the securities markets. It's their job to investigate huge trades of the sort you just mentioned, since those are usually signs that something odd is going on. But, to be fair to them, and I don't want to excuse them, they didn't catch these things, but it is hard because it is extremely widespread. If a company is bumbling along, and you invest in it, it's not going to go up or down very much, so your risk is very low. If you plan to buy it and sell it again a week or two or a month later, you're not normally at great risk. If you have reason to believe that something is going to happen, you have inside information, then the risk is very low. The chance of what you've heard about is there. You can only gain by it if it doesn't happen within the week or month that you expect. Well, then you just sell what you bought more or less at the same price. That's what I mean. The risk of these kinds of investments, very low. The chance of return, very high.
Right.
It's very hard in a society, a capitalist society, where there's a stock market, where this kind of gambling is everyday activity. Very hard not to have an enormous number of people playing elaborate games to do exactly that.
The reason I mentioned the Securities and Exchange Commission is that's an agency within the executive branch. The head of the Securities and Exchange Commission answers to Donald Trump, and
yes. That only compounds. That's right. They don't have the personnel. It's very difficult to do, and if the person in charge is someone over whom you have political power and authority, then yes, the collection of circumstances is precisely the sort that will likely make some writer 10 or 20 years from now, writing about the period we're living through, shaking his or her head at the massive fraud and gullibility that we are living through.
Oh, yeah, I think this Doral thing is huge. Well, I mean, when this came through 20 minutes ago, I thought that it was Andy Borowitz. Trump awards the G7 summit to himself. I mean, that's the headline in the Washington Post. And it's like, I thought this has got to be Andy Borowitz. Professor Wolf, we just have a minute and a half left before we hit the hard break here. Is there anything happening in the economic news right now that you think we need to be paying particular attention to? I mean, we were talking about the repo market a while ago. What's up now?
Yes. Two reports issued over the last 48 hours by the International Monetary Fund should scare the pants off everybody. Number one, that the trade war with China is really biting into the world economy, and in ways that will continue whether or not a deal is reached over the next 6 to 12 months. And the other report points out that in the aftermath of the crisis of 2008, when central banks, from the Federal Reserve on over to Bank of Japan and everything in between, lowered interest rates, record amounts, so that we even have negative interest rates in large parts of the world today, every corporation with a problem solved it by borrowing unheard amounts of money because it was virtually free for them to do so. The result is we're now facing the next downturn of our unstable capitalism with a level of corporate debt that the IMF calculates will make a large portion of major corporations unable to service the debt they've accumulated in the event of a downturn, which the majority of economists now think is virtually certain in the next 12 months. Those are two reports from the IMF, and they really ought to be explored, examined, and debated because of the fear and the reasonableness of the fear of what we're in store for.
Yeah. I saw that one in particular, that so many of these companies, if the downturn was even half as bad as 2008, it said it would flip all these companies.
They could not service their debt.
That's correct.
Which means everybody who lent to them, all the big banks, are back in the bottom of the toilet again, asking us to bail them out.
Yeah, there you go. Professor Richard Wolff, thank you so much for dropping by today.
Okay, glad to do it.
Always great talking with you. Always learn something. I really appreciate it. We'll be right back. It's 18 minutes past the hour.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So we've got Donald Trump hustling inside trades, apparently, or somebody in his crime family. We got Donald Trump awarding himself the G7. Really? And welcome back. William in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Hey, William, thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV. What's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, can you hear me?
Yes, just fine.
Okay, good. Look, we got the only Southern governor in place, John Bel Edwards, right now. We just went to the polls. He only got 47%, and he's in a runoff for, you would have to get, Eddie Rasponi is running against him, and you've used this term several times about the state houses and the governorships that want to have this constitutional thing to codify Citizens United. The first thing Eddie Rasponi came out of his mouth. Yeah. The first thing Eddie Rasponi said was he wanted to be in that conference of states or something. He didn't say to change the Constitution, but that slick style. Do you remember that term he used?
I don't. But so what you're saying, William, is that the Republican who's running for governor of Louisiana, opposite against John Bel Edwards, the Democrat who is the governor, the only Democratic governor in the South, that the Republican who's running against him is in bed with, or wants to jump into bed with, the Koch brothers and their buddies who are running this thing called the Convention of States, where they're going to basically call a constitutional convention and rewrite the Constitution to make it even more friendly to billionaires and big corporations. Is that the bottom line here, William?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks for the heads up on that. That's, grim news. Not surprising, but it's grim news. Joe in Tinton Falls, New Jersey, listening to WBAI. Hey, Joe, what's up?
Hey, how you doing?
Yeah.
Thank you for everything you do. I was just curious if you had any thoughts on the closing of WBAI in New York and whether you think there's any connection to some darker forces.
Yeah. Joe, I don't. I have a policy of not talking about my affiliates on the air, and I'm just going to stick to that. You know, when we lose an affiliate, gain an affiliate, whatever. I just don't. I don't talk about it on the air. Bronson in Columbia, South Carolina. Hey, Bronson, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, I just want to say real quick, you have some authoritarian censors on your YouTube channel who they basically stopped me from commenting because I said Russia is not my enemy. So I just want to point that out. Okay, right. I have a question. What is this absurd theory that it's somehow illegal to investigate Joe Biden because he's running for office? If the president suspects a U.S. citizen is committing crimes in another country, is there some kind of law that says he can't investigate that? I don't even understand what the narrative is.
Okay, it's pretty straightforward, Bronson. If Donald Trump thought that Joe Biden had broken the law in Ukraine, his campaign committee could have hired a private detective firm or anybody. Basically, they could have hired somebody to go into Ukraine and dig it up and figure out what's going on and all that kind of stuff. But what Trump did is he used official government property, policy, and employees. Is
he not in charge of the executive branch of government? I mean,
not in a corrupt fashion. No, he's not. You cannot run the government corruptly. How do you know it's corrupt? Because it's explicit. You can read the transcript. He was withholding $400 million worth of military aid to a country that felt that they had a gun to their heads and saying, I will give you this if you give me Joe Biden's head on a platter, essentially. And you can read it in the transcript. That is a crime, Bronson. It's not just an impeachable offense. It's a crime. Using government property for your own personal or political benefit is a violation of the Hatch Act, among a whole bunch of other things. We'll be right back. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. This didn't take long. Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, following the announcement of the Trump administration's intention to hold the G7 summit at Trump's Doral Golf Resort. Noah Bookbinder, the cruise executive director, says, quote, "This is unbelievable." This was my point. I thought this has got to be Eddie Borowitz, right? Given the potential consequences the president is facing for abusing the presidency for his own gain, we would have thought he would steer clear of blatant corruption, at least temporarily. Instead, he has doubled down on it. He is officially using the power of his office to help prop up his struggling golf business. There appears to be no bottom to Donald Trump's corruption. There is no question that the American government is being used as a public relations and marketing subsidiary of the Trump organization. Amen. And by the way, Fred got a letter this morning from Trump, or from the Trump campaign. No, it's from Trump. And listen to this. This is fascinating. It's to Fred Flintstone, of course. Fred, I'm hosting a lunch at a very nice hotel. That's in all caps and bold. Of course, it's a Trump hotel. At a very nice hotel in Chicago soon with only my top supporters. There's only one important name missing from that guest list, and that's you, Fred. Let's change that. I've saved 2 seats at lunch for you and a guest. Will you accept my invitation, Fred? We'll cover your flight. We'll cover your hotel. We'll cover your meal, and we can even take a photo together. Don't wait. This offer won't last long. Note, if you've saved your payment information, your donation will go through immediately. Kind of makes you think that you've been invited to lunch with Donald Trump, doesn't it? But, a little fine print down below, the hot link says, contribute $42 before October 23rd at 11:59 p.m. to be automatically entered to win a VIP trip to have lunch with me in Chicago. Right. The grift rolls on. This is absolutely breathtaking. I mean, who do you think is making the money on these trades? Do you think it's Trump himself? Is it Wilbur Ross? Is it a member of the Trump crime family? Is it Ivanka and Jared? Is it Don Jr.? I mean, literally, somebody made $1.5 billion in an afternoon. $1.5 billion. That's how much in debt Jared and Ivanka were, or are, actually, with their 666 Fifth Avenue property. Who do you think is making billions of dollars here on Trump's statements that are moving markets? And will Bill Barr forbid the FBI from looking into it? And if Bill Barr does tell the FBI they can't look into it, or if Donald Trump does tell the Securities and Exchange Commission they can't look into it, what do we do? Take it to the Supreme Court? Did we just spend an hour talking about that one? What do you think? How do you see this playing out? Is this just impeachment?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And any thoughts on how we can get rid of this Office of Legal Counsel letter from the Nixon and Clinton era that says you can't prosecute a sitting president when he commits crimes? In the Thom Hartmann Book Club today, we're reading from United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America and What We Can Do About It, by Nolan Higdon and Mickey Huff. And this is from the foreword by Ralph Nader. Ever since the few began to control the many, disinformation, fabrications, and distractions have been used to shape consent, impose submission, and maintain domination. Whether by the invoked authority of God, the divine right of kings, the dictatorial embodiment of a fatherland, the dictatorship of the proletariat, or the tyranny of commercially managed marketplaces, the casualty of such control has always been the ability of ordinary people to give voice to their own realities, needs, demands, and grievances. Given the inherent pragmatism of the human mind, the oppressed have often found it safer to believe rather than to think, to obey rather than dissent. Today, such a path is reinforced by a plutocratic political economy that allows corporations to dominate mass media, education, and the production of knowledge and memory. Human history, however, has not been without its visionaries, seers, and prescient intellectuals, poets, artists, thinkers, and philosopher rebels. Every major religion admonishes its adherents not to allow the merchant class, with its singular focus on aggregating profits at the expense of truth, compassion, and self-restraint, to amass too much power. Such instructions have emanated not from revelation, but from ethics learned via the daily experience of living in community with others committed to the common good. Unfortunately, it has not been the transactional incentives of commerce, but the cooperative bonds of community that dominate the most significant acts of life in the United States today. The dystopian scenarios portrayed in George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World look like understatements compared to today's plutocratic deployment of communications technologies, many of them developed by taxpayer-funded government programs and grants. The ultimate success of top-down censorship is self-censorship by the people. The same holds true for mass surveillance. From radio and television to the internet and smartphones and all the video platforms and apps in between, commercially controlled media have used seduction and addiction to lure users to increasingly stare into screens and share personal data and location, thus becoming complicit with authoritarianism and mass surveillance. In the process, the population has become fact-deprived and over-entertained, with lowered expectation levels and reduced attention spans. These technology-driven changes have distracted people from their rights and powers as citizens. As authors Nolan Higdon and Mickey Huff write, long before Trump's candidacy, ratings drove programming and news. In the process, celebrity, entertainment, scandal, crime, disaster, and spectacle clearly dominated over substantive reporting, and public interest advocacy capable of questioning and countering abuses of corporate power and government authority. Trump, they noted, came right out of the omnipresent corporate commercialism. Deadly degradation of media is everywhere. Fueled by Madison Avenue's promotional perfidy, the junk food industry, bypassing parental authority, has lied its way directly into the stomachs of tens of millions of children, creating an obesity epidemic with its attendant diseases. Alternative facts, anyone? 45 years ago, venerated CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite called the 3 minutes or so devoted to a serious news story merely a headline service. If anything, the situation has worsened since Cronkite's time. Gone are the fairness doctrine, the right of reply, and any pretense that the Federal Communications Commission is regulating the broadcasters according to the 1934 Communication Act standard of the public interest, convenience, and necessity. The takeover of hundreds of newspapers, local television stations, and radio stations by corporate profiteers is still worsening. These corporations loot vulnerable media operations by cutting out reporters, investigative journalists, whistleblowers, educational content, and local coverage. Magazines are shrinking, going out of business, or just migrating to online-only versions. Social media cannot generate such content in addition to other shortcomings. Young people today are becoming increasingly illiterate. They spend more time staring at screens, but ultimately read less long-form content unless forced to do so for classwork. Fewer people are showing up for town meetings, marches, demonstrations, and rallies, in spite of the ease and immediacy of communication enabled by the internet. The so-called information age has become the disinformation age, with the corporate media's exclusion of the civic community being one of its most devastating triumphs. In the 1960s and 1970s, we could not have succeeded in advancing standards for public health and safety, labor, and environmental integrity without the help of mass media reporting on public campaigns and congressional hearings, or without large audiences tuning into programs such as the Phil Donahue Show, which dedicated airtime to discussing our investigations, reports, and exposés. Now it is not just corporate media, but the Congress itself that is increasingly shutting out citizens groups. The United States of Distraction by Higdon and Huff.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. As I mentioned at some length in the first hour of the program, in the next hour of the program, in the third hour of the program, our old buddy Joe Madison, in my opinion, one of the, if not the best talk show host in America, one of the best talk show hosts in America, and a friend of Elijah Cummings is going to drop by to talk about Elijah Cummings, the passing of an extraordinary man, a true role model for people who want to be involved in governance, a role model of what it means to be a statesman. But we'll get into that in a little bit. So, picking up your phone calls, Maverick in Edmonds, Washington. Hey, Maverick, what's up?
You know, Tom, if corruption could fly, Washington, D.C. would be the busiest airport on the planet.
Yeah.
So about maybe a year and a half ago, I remember hearing this segment on one of NPR's little shows that they put on. And apparently they were reporting that someone had developed an algorithm that monitored Trump's tweets. And based on certain words that he would say, words that like superlatives, horrible, et cetera, they had developed a program that could be used to predict gains and losses in the stock market. So, I don't think Trump is smart enough to have figured this out on his own. But, oh my God, I said his name. Damn it! I broke a promise to myself. Let me repeat that. The Cheeto-faced troglodyte that currently resides in the Oval Office. Right. This guy is so corrupt. I mean, I could scream.
Oh, it goes beyond
day.
corrupt.
And
did you read his letter to Erdogan? It's like something that a high schooler would write to let's make a deal. Don't be stupid. I don't want you to slaughter people. It was tragic. And he passed this out at that meeting yesterday because he was so proud of it. This thing that he wrote. Not only is he a narcissist, not only is he mentally ill, not only is he unstable, not only is he a predator. Now we've got this new book out, 43 women. But he's also dumb. He's dumb as a stump. No wonder most of his businesses have gone bankrupt.
That's a lie, because I don't think he can write. So, again, he lied. You can almost
he dictated it then.
Possibly did. And, things are so bad that, like, if I pull up to get a latte somewhere and somebody says, what would you like? The first thing I want to say is a new president.
Yes. I get it. Yeah, no, we're all there.
I don't want to have a Howard Dean moment on your show here, but man, I'm worked up about this.
Okay,
Where's the tipping point, Tom? Where's the tipping point?
Well, I think we're there. I really think we're there. And this morning you got, now you've got Mike Pence over in Turkey. Erdogan met with him, but he did not fly the American flag. There's only 2 Turkish flags in the background, which is a slap in the face. And now Pence is doing a little press conference. And then you've got, just a few minutes ago, you had Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff and the head of the Office of Management and Budget, the guy who withheld the money to Ukraine, the military aid, until they coughed up something on Biden. The guy who actually pulled the trigger just held a press conference in which he said, yeah, of course that's what we did. Get over it. This is politics. It happens all the time.
I think you made a mistake on Thursday. You said things can't get worse.
Yeah, they just got worse. Yeah, and
they're going to keep getting worse.
I know. I know.
Getting worse.
This is why I've been saying, we have to have impeachment. We have to have it right away, because every time this guy wins, even something small, he goes for the next big thing. This Doral thing is like, it's such an obscenity. Yes, the Constitution says that the president cannot benefit from office, from emoluments. He can't benefit from being in office, but he's going to hold the G7 at his hotel. I mean, this is nuts. Maverick, I got to move along. But Anthony in Philadelphia. Hey, Anthony, what's up?
Hey, Tom, how's it going?
Good. What's on your mind?
I feel like in order to really get our government under control, in our pursuit of forming a more perfect democracy, we need to turn the office of the presidency into a council. And a council which includes experts in psychology, the environment, so that these, et cetera, so that they can talk about what will be the psychological effects of a particular piece of legislation on the American body. What will be the physical effects? What will be the effects to the environment?
Well, in theory, that's what the cabinet is.
I get that's what the cabinet is, but ultimately the president doesn't have to listen to them, and we're seeing a president who just goes rogue and does not accept the advice of his counsel. So why not empower them on the same level so that the office of the presidency is not taken over by an immature tyrant?
I think that, I get, Anthony, what you're trying to do is solve the problem of a broken president who has broken the presidency, a disaster. But let us not forget that when Citizens United, when that decision came down from the Supreme Court in 2010, and they literally wrote new laws, which they do not have the authority to do under the Constitution, saying that money is free speech, money being used in politics, and the corporations are persons, and corporations can participate in the political arena under the rubric of First Amendment free speech. When they came down with that decision, the dissent in that decision from John Paul Stevens, in that dissent, he said, because of this decision, I'm paraphrasing, because of this decision, we will have foreign interference in our elections. And the example he used was Tokyo Rose. You can read it in the dissent. It's only 2 pages long. It's easy to read. You can Google it online. John Paul Stevens' dissent in the Citizens United, October 2010 Citizens United decision. And he said, under this decision, and again, I'm paraphrasing from memory. It's been a few years since I read it, but he's basically, under this decision, Tokyo Rose could have contributed money to American politicians and could have inserted herself into American elections. Tokyo Rose, of course, was the famous World War II propaganda voice out of Japan, telling the U.S. soldiers the war is lost, don't worry, just go home, you no need to fight with us because we're going to win, and, quack, quack, quack. And she was, notorious and widely hated in the United States. And this is exactly what happened. Donald Trump was brought to us by the Supreme Court, just like Ronald Reagan was brought to us by the Supreme Court. It was the Buckley decision in 76 and the First National Bank decision in 78 that opened the floodgates to corporate and billionaire money in 79 and 80 that put Ronald Reagan into the White House, that have kept Republicans in power ever since. And it was the doubling down on that in 2010 with Citizens United that allowed so much foreign interference and the manipulation of Facebook and other things like this by foreign entities into our election sphere, without any practical consequences. I mean, it's just and so let's be very clear. The problem that we have was created by the Supreme Court, which takes us back to that first hour topic. Anthony, thank you for the call. We're all struggling with this. What do we do? How do we deal with this, with this guy in the White House? Tim in Houston, Texas. Hey, Tim, what's on your mind today?
Well, good morning, Mr. Tom. I've got a suggestion, I'd like to hear your comments on the idea. Since the Republicans seem to have beat the devil out of us, real people, over the last 50 years, would it not be possible to turn their own methodology against them and concentrate on just one item, one message, and that is, in the upcoming election, you've got a choice to make, and that choice is either plutocrats or people. And you've got to make the choice, people, because until that's solved, you're not going to get your country back.
Well, that's the message that you're getting from Elizabeth Warren and from Bernie Sanders. And if either one of them are the party's nominee, that is going to be the issue. And it's going to be explicit, and it's going to be front and center. And I think that you will have an absolute blowout. The Democrats will sweep everything. On the other hand, some of the other candidates, I think it might be a little less in that direction, although broadly speaking, I think the entire Democratic field is getting it, that we've got a problem here with plutocracy. Tim, thanks for the call. Pat in Watertown, Connecticut. Hey, Pat, what's up?
Hey, how are you doing, Tom?
Good. What's on your mind?
Good. Hey, just with what Mulvaney was saying today about get over it, he's going to do what he wants to do. We talk about Doral, and there's an election in 2020, which means he's got to answer to the American people for everything he's saying up to this point.
Right.
What happens when if he gets reelected and he doesn't have another election? He's just going to go crazy.
Oh, I agree. If Donald Trump is reelected, it's the end of the American Republic. It's the end of the American experiment, period. And I don't mean that in some kind of hyperbolic sense. I believe he will destroy our government. He already is. I mean, he's selling off our public lands. He's gutting our agencies. He's gutting labor rights. He's gutting the education of our students. He's pouring money into his corrupt defense contractors. There's a great piece in either the Post or the Times. I think it's the New York Times today on the front page about how just the war in Afghanistan and Iraq would have paid for Medicare for all. You know, if we just hadn't had those two wars, that amount of money would have paid for Medicare for all the 20 years that we've had those wars going on. And, you know, I mean, there's so many ways that we can get things done. But, you know, I think that if Trump is reelected, you know, I think that we are, as a country, really and truly toast. We're going to be going the way that Hungary is under Viktor Orban, or Poland is under President Duda, or the Philippines is under Duterte. Yeah, this is dangerous stuff. Pat, spot on. And that's one of the reasons why, you know, if you're not registered to vote, double check or even if you are, if you think you are, double check, especially in a Republican-controlled state.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this. And welcome back, Robin in Kingston, Washington. Hey, Robin, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I want to report to you and tie in your concerns about the Supreme Court and what dangers we face. I'm a political activist, and I have take opportunities to be in the streets in different locations at least weekly out here. And I have a set of apparatus that you actually might have seen when you were up to Seattle, certainly. The 700 people who attended Seattle saw how I set up. And on the 4th of July, I had 3 such apparatus set up at a public park in Kingston. It was run and managed by the Port of Kingston.
Kingston, Washington.
And Kingston, Washington. And there was a music concert going on, and there's a nice stage there. And it was the 4th of July celebration, so there are 400, 500, 600 people in the audience. I set my apparatus up for about the 40th time in the last 10 years down in this park. And it was beside the stage. It was informing people. It wasn't blocking anybody. I was interfering with nobody. And even though the messages aren't important, I will share them with you. I had one apparatus that said, it's a kind of a word board, or information board, large one, stands tall. Greenpeace, yes on both. Elect matrilineal governances on another. Then I had a big 10-foot by 5-foot banner. On one side, I have painted a huge word Earth, and then the word save just before it. And then on the other side, I had the huge word vote, and the smaller words beside it, save democracy.
Right.
Well, the Port of Kingston insisted that I move, even though I had been there 40 times in the last 10 years. I refused to move. I said, I'm exercising my First Amendment rights for political free speech in the public square. I was interfering with nobody, obstructing nobody. I was polite. I was quiet. I said, no, I'm not going to move. They called the police. They got the police to give me an option, move to another, vacated part of the park, or be arrested for obstruction. So I said, okay, I understand my 2 choices. What does arrested for obstruction mean? The policeman never answered my question. They arrested me. Right. And the final charge turns out that it's criminal trespass warning. So any of the gray hairs who listen and watch your show, who remember the issues and the battles of free speech, who understand the principle that the First Amendment is first for a reason.
Right.
The only way the oligarchs can keep control is to continue to misinform us. And one of the ways that we absolutely can inform each other is through such messaging in public places, depending upon the First Amendment for political free speech in the public square.
Yeah, I get it. Robin, were you ultimately prosecuted, or did they drop charges?
I'm still in court right now, and if anybody wants to jump amicus, you can have in the Seattle area, contact your show, and I give you authorization to give them my number. I am in court. I'll be having a jury trial, thankfully, on December 2nd.
Okay.
But the bottom line of the story is it's expensive. Okay, and it's completely wrong.
Right, and the number that we should pass, is this your New Hampshire number, the 603 number?
Yes, it's a New Hampshire number, but I'm in Kingston, Washington.
I got it. Robin, thank you for the call. Good talking to you. We'll be back. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. United States of America. It's all over that video over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. Welcome back. 51 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you, speaking the truth to the multinational corporations we'd really rather you didn't know all about. Sharon in San Francisco. Hey, Sharon, what's up? Thanks for listening to iHeartRadio.
Back to your subject of making money when Trump says something.
Right.
I remember a couple of years ago, Carl Icahn, his buddy, made a bunch of money by selling aluminum before Trump made those announcements about his tariffs.
That's right.
And also, the SEC, I don't believe they have enough commissioners to do anything. So they can't follow this stuff.
Now, I know that's true of the Federal Election Commission, or the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, but I didn't know that was true of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC.
I think it's the SEC.
Huh.
The woman who's in charge there now is bemoaning the fact that she doesn't have enough.
No, you're thinking of Ellen Weintraub, who is the head of the
Yes.
Federal Election Commission, not the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Sorry.
So, but
And
I mean, it may well be that the Securities and Exchange Commission is paralyzed too, and I just don't have that information at the top of my, of my brain.
Yeah.
So
Trump appoints those people, right?
Well, he appoints a couple of them. You know, I think they serve 10 years terms, and they don't all go on and off at the same time. So there's these overlaps, and some of them may be 5-year terms. I mean, I think maybe different agencies are different. But the one big appointment that he makes is the head, the chair of the commission. But what he's done with the Federal Election Commission, there have been a couple of Democrats who have retired, and he has not replaced them. He would have to offer it to a Democrat, but he has not replaced them, and therefore they don't have a quorum. So they legally cannot meet, and they legally cannot do anything. And therefore they can't enforce the federal election laws. I'm convinced that, I'm getting these emails from Trump literally every day begging me for money, and some of them fairly deceptive, like the one I read on the air earlier that really makes you think that you are being invited to lunch with Trump. Just click here, and by the way, we've saved your credit card, so you just click here and boom, $47 goes to the Trump campaign. I am guessing that there are probably tens of thousands of Americans who have given Trump more than I think it's $2,700 is the legal maximum now, that have given Trump more than that amount of money. And maybe tens, 20s, 30s, $50,000. I mean, people. I have a feeling that there's some elderly people who are wiping out their savings, and who would stop that from happening? The Federal Election Commission, and Trump has crippled it, and it's going to stay that way until after the elections. So there will be no enforcement of these laws. Which is another just, insane, obscene thing. Sharon, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. Walter in Cupertino, California, listening on 910 AM. Hey, Walter, what's up?
Oh, hi. What I wanted to talk about is the Trump supporters, because so many times people just kind of don't understand how they can still support him at every time we hear something terrible that Trump does.
Right.
And this isn't my own idea, but I remember reading a book about this idea of an honor culture. And in the honor culture, loyalty is really, really important. And I feel that a lot of these folks that are supporting Trump come from that background.
Well, this is also consistent with authoritarian worldviews. People, about 20% of our population are authoritarians. About 1% of that 20% are authoritarian leaders. 99% are authoritarian followers. But that concept of loyalty to authority is at the core of authoritarianism. So I think that we're probably talking about the same thing, Walter.
Well, it's a little different. They talk about, it was in this book I read, it described all these people were killing people that they knew in Appalachia. If you were a stranger, you'd be treated nicely, but they had these feuds going on.
Yeah.
They're trying to figure it out.
The Hatfields and McCoys kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah, and it came back from these folks who were like shepherds, and they needed to kind of overreact because if someone stole your sheep, you'd be out. As opposed to farmers, you need to focus on working cooperatively. And so it's almost like you've got the sense of the people in the cities who are working together or close together can't understand how these other folks need to save their honor.
Well, that's fascinating. In other words, the pastoralist societies, the people who herded goats and sheep and things, had organized their society differently than the agriculturalists, the farmers, and probably quite differently from the hunter-gatherers because of the importance of that, food on the hoof, basically. That was their future.
Right, and so what you needed to do is if somebody was going to take one of your goats, you needed to shoot them, because if you didn't, everyone was going to take all your goats. Right. And then that translates into someone looks at your wife funny, and you're going to shoot that guy rather than just kind of work it out in a different way.
Right.
And so it seems like when Trump does these outrageous things, that kind of is consistent with their kind of worldview of how you are to behave, right? You say these outrageously terrible things against your opponents.
So how does pastoralist culture translate into Appalachia? I mean, Appalachia is not, there are not goat herders in Appalachia.
They were showing how these people generations before had come from like Scotland, and that's what their culture had been there, and that these things had survived over many generations.
Fascinating.
And so I think that
what's the title of the book, Walter?
I can't recall, and it was either the guy who wrote Moneyball, or it was the guy who wrote about how the kid kills the giant with the stone.
If you track it down, let me know, would you? I'm fascinated. Walter, thank you very much for the call. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment by yours truly. This is from Chapter 1, The Unholy Alliance of Racism, Genocide, and Guns. In Isaiah 14:21, the Lord tells Isaiah, "Prepare for his sons a place of slaughter because of the iniquity of their fathers." It's a variation on the old story of karma and seems in a very real way to be playing out today in the United States. America is facing an epidemic. Public health officials use that word of gun-related suicides, accidents, and even homicides and police killings. That epidemic has grown worse in the past decade, largely because the number of guns in America has increased, in large part because of the racial fears of white men who have bought guns in record numbers for 8 years during the time in office of America's first black president. A landmark 1999 study from researchers Franklin Zimmerman and Gordon Hawkins showed that the main correlation, far surpassing mental illness, socioeconomic status, or race, that could be defined as causal in predicting the rates of gun deaths is a simple number, the number of guns distributed among society. In the 30 years since that study, Zimmerman and Hawkins' results have been replicated and reanalyzed dozens of times. As the American Academy of Pediatrics said in a release published in AAAS's Science magazine, quote, new research shows dramatic differences in the number of children hospitalized and killed each year in the U.S. from firearm-related injuries based on their state's gun legislation, even after adjusting for poverty, unemployment, and education rates. It found twice as many pediatric firearm deaths in states with the most lenient gun regulations compared to states where gun laws are strictest, end quote. They added that this is a critical issue for children, quoting Stephanie Cho, MD, the lead author of the abstract, quote, firearm-related injuries are the second leading cause of death among children in the United States, but we found a clear discrepancy in where those deaths happen that corresponds with the strengths of states' firearm legislation. In states with lenient laws, children die at alarmingly greater rates, end quote. And unsurprisingly, America not only has unusually lenient gun laws, but also has more guns in civilian hands than any other country in the world. America has a bit more than 4% of the world's population, but holds almost 50% of all the guns in civilian hands worldwide, more than 390 million guns. And the more guns a society has, the more gun deaths it will experience. The NRA and their army of lobbyists have been quite successful in making this happen. During Obama's presidency, there was a steady and hysterical drumbeat of articles, emails, and political proclamations by so-called pro-gun politicians and think tanks, suggesting that Obama was preparing to take away everyone's guns at any minute. There was even a subtext embraced by the hard right that he wasn't going to stop there. After disarming white Americans, these folks said, Obama was going to intern them in otherwise unused FEMA camps. Flipped-out gun owners were repeatedly arrested during the Obama years trying to break into retired or temporarily vacant military facilities and toxic waste sites, looking for evidence to prove that Obama was, in fact, preparing the modern-day version of the World War II-era Japanese internment camps. White supremacy was the founding notion of this nation. White Europeans thought themselves so superior to the human beings they met here in 1492 that Columbus himself became the first North American slaver, shipping Taino Indians back to Spain as slaves to the royal family. A slave is as good as gold, Columbus wrote for the king and queen. Europeans in the Americas then stepped up that game into a hemisphere-wide campaign of racial genocide, pulling off the largest multi-generational mass murder in the history of the world. In the midst of that effort, they also created the legal mechanisms necessary to define and legally regulate slavery, and even built those systems into America's founding document, the Constitution. America was birthed in slavery and genocide, and both needed guns. It was the superior weaponry of guns that gave the European settlers a massive advantage over the bow and arrow-equipped Native Americans, and it was the raw power of widespread white ownership of guns in the South that propped up the institution of slavery for hundreds of years. Without guns, neither would have been possible, or at least neither would have been as easy as they were to pull off. And now, after centuries of guns being used to kill off and keep down people of color in America, those same guns are creating a terrifying epidemic of gun-facilitated violence, from public schools to private homes and public concerts. It's enough to make one think that Isaiah was onto something. Chapter 2, The Sanitized History of America. The United States' expansion and conquest in the late 18th century through the 19th century and into the 20th century is a history written by white men, inked in the blood of Native Americans, and built on the broken and bloody backs of enslaved people brought here from Africa. From 1791, when the Bill of Rights went into effect, until the end of the Civil War, the Second Amendment protected the rights only of white men to own guns. This is simply because until the ratification of the 14th Amendment, states determined who was recognized as a person protected under the Constitution. Initially, in most states, that meant that white men who owned land and paid taxes were the only people considered full citizens under the Constitution. In the South, white men with guns formed slave patrols to control slaves and formed posses to hunt escaped slaves. the book The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment. In the Thom Hartmann Book Club today, we're Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the third hour of our program. What a day! Some Mick Mulvaney coming out and saying, "Yeah, of course we did it. Get over it. It's just politics." And Mike Pence going to Turkey, where Erdogan won't even have an American flag in the room. A slap in the face to America. This totally bizarre man in the White House. And then on top of all of this, we lose Elijah Cummings. He was born just 5 months before me. I mean, which is a little kind of close to the bone. And just an extraordinary man who was such a role model for of true statesmanship. On the line is our old buddy Joe Madison, the host of his own show, the Joe Madison Show on Sirius XM on the Urban View channel in the mornings. And Joe, welcome back to the program. It's always nice talking with you.
Well, yeah, it's always good to talk about public policy and other issues. I'm just sad that we had to wake up this morning to the news that Elijah Cummings had passed away. Yes. But I do want to comment on this thing about the American flag not even being in the room with the vice president. I think Elijah Cummings would agree with me, Tom. This shows the ultimate disrespect for the presidency, for the United States, and it's because they disrespect this man who is now president of the United States. Yeah. I mean, this is a symbolic slap in the face. And the president of Turkey, I think, just has his number, like a lot of leaders around the country. But Elijah Cummings and I were fraternity brothers, Phi Beta Sigma. We both became honorary members of Phi Beta Sigma, along with, you remember, Charles Ogletree, the outstanding professor of law from Harvard, and all of us were brought into that fraternity together. And he also listened, Tom, to the show every single morning.
I know he spoke really, he spoke of you many times. He obviously really loved you in the show. My sense was, I don't think that you and I have talked specifically about Elijah Cummings before, but my guess was that you guys knew each other, in more than just a casual way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like I said, we were fraternity brothers and went into it together. But the district he represented, and I want people to understand something, and forgive the noise in the background, but he came from a district that was represented by very strong men. Historically, you should understand the first African American representative of his district was Perrin Mitchell. and he came from a political family, a civil rights family. He was the brother of Clarence Mitchell, who was known as the 101st Senator. He was a lobbyist for the NAACP and one of the founders of the Congressional Black Caucus. And then when he passed away or retired, Kwesi Mfume. And then after Kwesi Mfume gave up the seat to become the head of the NAACP, then it was Elijah Cummings. And all three were very strong, outspoken members of Congress and represented their district in a very unique way. But Elijah Cummings used to tell this story about how he always loved this story about how when he was in high school, I guess someone in his school, I don't know if it was a teacher, said he'd never amount to anything. He wasn't smart enough to be a lawyer.
Wow.
And he went on not only to graduate from college, Howard, but he graduated from law school. And you know who his first client was?
No.
The person who said he'd never be a lawyer.
Oh, really?
Was his first
that teacher? Wow.
It was that teacher was his first client.
That's incredible. That's a beautiful story. So, I mean, Elijah Cummings is also the chair of the House Oversight Committee, which is one of the 5 committees that are conducting impeachment hearings. What is this going to mean for the impeachment process? And I mean, just the idea that somebody could fill his shoes. He was such a. His voice had such authority. You know, he was such a huge figure.
And one of the, and that's absolutely right. And one of the reasons he was as effective as he was, unlike our president that we have now, he listened to his staff. I think that's what people ought to understand. He had a very powerful staff, a very effective group of staff people who listened to him. And, now they have someone, I guess, who will, a temporary staff member, a member of Congress, but it will probably have the same staff. So we can look at that as a hopefully a positive. The only thing I can say to you, and people say this all the time, who's going to fill his shoes? My response to that is you can't fill his shoes.
Right.
I mean, let's just be quite honest. What you have to do is create your own footprints.
Yeah.
And that's what I hope they will look for someone that Nancy Pelosi and the leadership will look to someone who will just follow through with the work that he has done at this time. But no one, and this is what we're really saying to each other, was as passionate, as intelligent, and let me tell you, man, and I won't use profanity on your show, but I think you'll understand this. he didn't take any stuff.
Yeah, I get it.
Anybody.
Yeah.
You get it.
Yeah, I get it.
You get it.
And that was so clear.
Anybody.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And but at the same time, unlike a lot of his colleagues, he never had a harsh word to say outside that committee to his political opponent. Mm-hmm. And that's why you're getting condolences from people across the aisle. He was, I think you said it, he was a statesman.
Yeah.
And that's what we're lacking. And that's why I think people feel this great loss from all sides.
Yeah. Yeah, a personal loss on your end as a friend and a institutional loss for all of us.
I should point out we knew that this was coming. Unfortunately, he had been sick.
Yeah, he had had heart surgery 2 years ago, I guess, and it didn't quite take.
Yeah, and his sister called me this morning because she was listening to the show. But, I tell people, you can't imagine how intimidating it is to be a talk personality and know that the chairman of one of the most powerful committees is listening to you every day, Tom, on his commute to Washington. And by the way, if you made a mistake, he'd pick up the phone and call.
Whoa.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And I would, and, you know, and he would tell the producer, or Sherry, my executive producer, he would tell her, Joe needs to correct that.
Yeah.
Or he needs to correct this. Or he would call, get on the air and say, you know what? You're telling the people the truth. And I'm here to validate what you're saying. And that I will always appreciate about him.
Yeah. A good man, a light has left, you know, has left our world.
Or as someone said about Paul Robeson, a mighty tree has fallen in our forest.
There you go. That's brilliant. Joe Madison, every morning, Sirius XM. Joe, thanks so much for being with me today.
Hey, thank you, Tom. Thank you.
Yeah, good talking. We'll be back, and we'll continue our conversations about what's going on in the news and, take your calls on the issues of the day right after this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
It's 15 minutes past the hour. Stick around. And welcome back. Steve in New Boston, Michigan. Hey, Steve, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I got a three-part question all regarding voting.
Okay.
I've heard you say, and I agree with you, that we should all find out if we are registered voters. First part of the question is, how do we do that? Second part of the question
let me just take these one at a time, if I may, Steve. Okay. Here in Oregon, I can log on to the Oregon Secretary of State's website and see my own voter registration. And make sure that I have my address right and, all that kind of stuff. It's all right there online. I would be surprised if Michigan hasn't done the same thing. So I would start with the Secretary of State's office, just to plug into a search engine, Michigan Secretary of State voter registration, put those words in, and see if it pops up. Second question.
Okay. Second question. People that receive absentee ballots, is that a guarantee because I get an absentee ballot from my county clerk's office that I am a legally registered voter?
In all probability, the laws vary from state to state is one of the problems, Steve. It's there are no federal standards for voting or election laws, which is something that, we all need to have a conversation about. But so I don't know the exact policy in the state of Michigan. It's funny. Yesterday here in Oregon, we're having an election, and I got my ballot yesterday in the mail. And I said to Louise this morning as I was leaving, I said, I ought to take this in and vote while I'm on the air. Because in Oregon, everybody gets one of those ballots. I mean, it's all vote by mail. There are no voting places anymore here in Oregon. There's no place you can go.
Here in Michigan, it's different. You can go into the schools and vote, or absentee ballot,
right? Or
like
absentee
some people
ballot
in this household do.
And in some states, you can only get an absentee ballot if you can prove that you are, in trouble somehow, or you're sick, or you're out of state. In other, they make it very hard. In some of the states, you can only get it once. And then you've got to reapply every time you want it. And in some states, and I believe California is one of them, you can put yourself on the permanent absentee ballot list, and basically you have vote by mail. Vote by mail works spectacularly well here in Oregon. Washington State has picked it up; they're doing it there too. In fact, maybe I'll vote on the air tomorrow, just to plug it. But what you need to do is you need to check with your Secretary of State's office. And what was your third piece of that question?
The third one is, back in 2016, we heard there was something like 90,000 Michigan voters that were not counted. When this happens, if you were a valid voter in the state, if you were suddenly kicked off of the rolls, shouldn't you be notified that you are no longer a registered voter in this state, so that you have a chance to redo it instead of just say, okay, you took all your time, you stood in line, you did your part, and now your vote don't count.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's actually a couple of issues in Michigan. The first was that several 100,000 people were removed from the voting rolls, and probably some of them had moved out of state or died. which is the excuse that they always use. But no doubt, lots of them simply lived in areas that had a lot of Democratic voters, particularly around Detroit and Flint, number one. And number two, the 80,000 number, as I recall, there were 80,000 people who voted all the down ballot stuff and never voted for president. And and of course Trump won Michigan by what, 15,000 votes or something like that. So there's some concern, and those votes were all out of the Detroit area. And of course the Rick Snyder, the white Republican power structure, was saying, well, it's because those people in Detroit are just dumb people or something like that. No,
we've heard it. You had the same name as somebody else. Well, just because you got the same name should not mean you shouldn't be able to vote.
That's right, especially if it's a common name. Steve, thanks for the call. Okay. This is all stuff that we really, really need to be fixing. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Appropriate. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Jewel in O'Brien, Florida. Hey, Jewel, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, good to talk to you. I've been watching you ever since you first came on Free Speech.
Well, thank you.
First-time caller, though.
Okay.
And what I wanted to talk about today, I got a letter last Friday, and it was from a group called America First Policies.
Mm-hmm.
And it was saying that I had possibly been taken off of the voter rolls, and they sent me a voter registration with a self-addressed envelope, to send it back in and everything. So anyway, two things right quick. They called me I'm a Mr., of course, and they called me a Mrs., and they spelled my name. They put two L's on the end of it instead of one. But anyway, I've reported it to the election supervisor, which is a Republican here in O'Brien, Florida, and they just kind of blew it off.
Right.
But what I'm thinking that maybe this is to get people to fill this out and mail it in, then you're trying to register twice and they take you off of the voter rolls or something. I'm not sure.
I'm guessing, Jewel, that if you look at the return address on that thing, that it wasn't actually going to the Secretary of State and it wasn't actually a voter registration, that what you were doing was signing up to be a contributor to and a member of that super PAC. Do you still have the envelope?
No, sir. I've got the envelope right here.
Who's it addressed to?
Swanee Supervisor of Election.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Live Oak, Florida.
And it's the right address. Well, that's very interesting.
Yeah, it was correct, but it's a scam, I'm sure.
In all probability, although, if they've done a massive removal of people from the voting roll lists and they think that you're a Republican voter, they might be trying to get you back on. When you called the election officials, did you find out if your registration is still valid?
Oh, I'm still there. I went online and looked, and I'm still there.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I'm spelling my name wrong. Whoever sent this, and it's put out by this people, America First Policy.
Right, which is a super PAC, I believe.
Yeah, and when I went and Googled that, it went straight to Mike Pence's website.
Oh, really?
It did.
So there you go. Jewel, I don't have any advice beyond, good on you for keeping your eyes open, looking for these scams and checking your voter registration. That's all good, important stuff. I got to move along, though. Thank you for the call. Tom in Orlando, Florida. A lot of Florida callers today. Hey, what's up, Tom?
Hi, Tom. I was listening to Richard Wolff. Always enjoy hearing him. He said something about how the stock market insider trading is rampant and they're understaffed. My first question was, how do they get a hold of Martha Stewart, if that's the case? But I don't know.
I believe that the Martha Stewart prosecution was, I think it was more of a, first of all, it wasn't the SEC, it was a local prosecutor. And as I recall, and I think it was probably politically motivated, but that's just my recollection.
That's kind of what I'm getting at.
But virtually all of these federal agencies are right now massively understaffed. I mean, the first 2 years of the Trump administration, they gave 20,000 people in the Social Security Administration early furlough, let them go. And so what's happening is people are waiting months now to hear from Social Security when they apply to go on Social Security. Everything is slowing down, and this is all this is their strategy. Reagan laid this out. It's called starve the beast. You starve the beast, you break the agency basically, so it no longer can serve the people. Then when the people start complaining about the agency not doing a good job, you say, well, I've got a solution for you. Let's just privatize Social Security. Let's just turn Medicare over to Medicare Advantage and give it all to United Healthcare. Let's get government out of the business, because as you can see, government doesn't do things well. That's what's going on, Tom. But
the other thing I was talking about, insider trading can also be done not just in the stock market, but in real estate. I mean, being from Orlando, I know about, people come in, buy swampland for a song and put up a theme park. And, I think that happens more than we realize. And I've been getting notices from people who want to buy my house. I have a great house.
Yeah.
But they say, oh, we'd like to buy it, pay cash.
Yeah. Well, so either something is coming along, in your neighborhood, and somebody's got some inside information, or it's there are foreign investors actually who buy real estate, but that's probably a little less likely. Yeah, Tom, in fact, that was the example that Richard Wolff used, when he was describing this, was the real estate example. He said, if a company is going to expand and they're going to build a factory in, I forget what state he mentioned, and you happen to live in that state, you buy up the land in advance because you know the factory's coming, that's insider trading too, even though it doesn't involve stock. Although the stuff that is apparently coming out of the Trump crime family or some of his cronies involves literally over $1 billion worth of stock, which is mind-boggling. Tom, thanks for the call. Good talking to you. We'll be back with more of your calls in the news of the day in just a moment. Mick Mulvaney on TV just admitted quid pro quo.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
These are going full brazen. Quid pro quo? Yeah, get used to it. Really? Hartmann Book Club is R.I.P. GOP, How the New America is Dooming the Republicans by Stanley B. Greenberg. This is from the introduction. This book tells an amazing story, and if you hadn't seen what happened to America over the last 4 years, you wouldn't believe it. It even has a happy ending that's none too soon for all of those of us who've been fighting who've had enough fighting, division, and enough politics. This time, the end of politics portends a country united and finally liberated from gridlock to address the nation's most serious problems. It ends with the death of the Republican Party as we've known it, while the survivors work to recreate the party of Lincoln, relevant for our times. It ends with the Democratic Party liberated from the nation's suffocating polarization to use government to advance the public good as the country used to expect. You see, our country is hurtling toward a new America that is ever more racially and culturally diverse, younger, millennial, more secular and unmarried, with fewer traditional families and male breadwinners, more immigrant and foreign-born who are more concentrated in the growing metropolitan areas, which are magnets for investment and for people. The new America encompasses a vast array of family types and working families in which both the men and women face growing challenges. The new America is ever more racially blended and multinational, more secular and religiously pluralistic. The new America embraces the country's immigrant and foreign character. It now includes the college-educated and suburban women who want respect and equality in a multicultural America. America was shaped by major social movements, civil unrest, political battles, and government action at historic junctures, and by the choices the two national political parties took that created a more modern America. Each moved America away from traditional strictures on blacks, women, and immigrants. Each juncture made America freer, more equal, and more democratic. Those choices put the Democratic Party on a trajectory that aligned Democrats with the country's emerging civic norms and alienated the Republican Party from the country and from itself. America was changed profoundly by the battle to pass the civil rights laws that ended racial segregation and ensured blacks had the right to vote. Bipartisan immigration laws reopened the country to non-Anglo-Saxon immigration in 1965 and greatly expanded it in the late 1980s. The Supreme Court put women on a path to greater independence and equality when it declared in 1965 that women have a right to privacy and birth control, and in 1973 when it made abortion legal. And these different choices came to fruition with the election and re-election of Barack Obama, the first African-American president whose activist government produced a Tea Party movement and revolt that accelerated the polarization of the country and made attributes about race and immigration matter as never before. The Tea Party and Donald Trump battled to stop history and stop government. At each juncture, the Democrats were deeply divided, sometimes more than the Republicans. This was true on matters of civil rights, immigration, and abortion. Nonetheless, after these defining social issues were settled in law or by the U.S. Supreme Court, national Democratic leaders embraced and defended the social changes and new freedoms that aligned the party with a modernizing America and its values. After more than 5 decades of such choices, the Democratic Party is associated with equal rights, equality, gender equality, tolerance, openness to diversity, and more. The Republicans' electoral base was in the South and later in the Appalachian Valley and rural states across the country, so at each juncture they escalated their battle against these national changes. The party's national leaders ignored their own deep divisions and worked inventively to show they were champions of white people during the battle over civil rights and affirmative action. Its leaders scorned the sexual revolution and championed to this day a constitutional amendment to make abortion illegal. They were opposed to women breaking free of the patriarchal family and winning equality. They mobilized against illegal immigration in the states and nationally, fueled by Patrick Buchanan's 3 campaigns for president. Newt Gingrich led a revolution in the early 1990s that put the GOP into a total war footing against the Democratic Party, determined to expand the liberal welfare state and marginalize conservatism. But those forces defeated him. The Tea Party led the GOP's life and death battle against President Obama and his Affordable Care Act, fueled by Tea Party protests that elevated white racial resentment and hostility to immigrants. Defeating and delegitimizing the President Obama was the last chance to stop the new America from winning. Obama's 2008 election, the Wall Street bailout, and the searing battle to pass Obamacare produced the Tea Party revolt and the Tea Party wave election of 2010, the most consequential election of our lifetime. It gave the Tea Party-fueled Republican Party effective control of the U.S. House and Senate, 2/3 of the governorships, and more than 60% of the state legislative chambers, which rushed to radically redraw the legislative and congressional maps to ensure big GOP majorities for a decade. The Tea Party-led GOP pushed the country into fiscal austerity and to deconstruct government, to stop Democrats from using government for positive ends or paying off its growing coalition with new entitlements. The book R.I.P. GOP. Thom Hartmann Cruise will be sailing in July of 2020. The 7-day Oceania cruise will be going to Bermuda, and I'll be hosting onboard events about the topics of the day. More info at thomhartmann.com or 800-856-1155. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Just trying to keep up with what's going on in the news. Mick Mulvaney, he just came out and said, yeah, there was a quid pro quo. We said to Ukraine, you're not going to get your military stuff unless you find some dirt on Joe Biden. And that happens all the time. That's politics. Get over it. That's essentially what Mick Mulvaney said. The chief of staff to Donald Trump, the acting chief of staff, acting head of the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB. The big question had always been, okay, who was it who pulled the trigger? Who was it who said, no, we're not going to send this money, or the military weaponry that is associated with the money? We're not going to send that to the, well, in this case, it was Ukraine. We're not going to send that to Ukraine. And turns out it was Mick Mulvaney. He was the bag man. And he's on TV today defending himself with yeah, you don't like it? Stuff it. Try and do something about it, buddy. And that's essentially what Mick Mulvaney was saying. Meanwhile, Mike Pence goes over to Turkey to grovel at the feet of Mr. Erdogan, who has a photo op with Pence and him and himself. And traditionally, when a head of state meets another head of state, you have the flags of both countries, hanging on the wall or on stands behind them. There were two Turkish flags, one behind Erdogan and one behind Pence. No American flag, a little tiny one down, on the table, but no real actual American flag, which is, as Joe Madison pointed out a little bit ago, just a absolute right in your face insult. And then Trump tweets out that he is declaring victory in a war that he started. That is, Turkey coming in and taking out the Kurds, basically, slaughtering the Kurds. You have literally, murder and rape and pillaging going on in some of these villages by Turkish forces and people aligned with the Turkish forces. Oh no, we're victorious in the war. We only let a few thousand ISIS guys go, and now there's a ceasefire. And Turkey's foreign minister replies, going, no, there's not a ceasefire. It's a pause for a couple days so that the Kurds can run before we finish this job and take all this territory. And then Trump yesterday says, oh, yeah, the Kurds, they're as bad terrorists as ISIS, which, of course, is the talking point from Turkey, from Erdogan. So the question in my mind, and I've been asking this on the air every day this week, ever since Sunday when Trump pulled the plug on our allies, the Kurds, is why? Why did Trump do what Turkey wanted him to do? Why did he say, sir, yes, may I have another sir? Why did he grovel at the feet of a dictator of a small country, Erdogan and Turkey? Is it because he's got a Trump Tower there? Is it because he's invested in 119 businesses in Turkey? Is it because, Erdogan is buying missile systems now from Russia and President Putin called up Trump and said, hey, get with the program? What's going on here? Why did he do this? That question is, in my opinion, not being asked enough. And there's certainly, unless you know something I do, as far as I can tell, there is no answer to that question right at this moment. I'm very concerned about that. Kurt in Greeley, Colorado. Hey, Kurt, thanks for listening to SiriusXM. What's up?
Yes, about, Syria and abandoning our Kurdish allies and a chink in the armor to Trump's support. I've talked to many of my battle buddies who've served with Kurds, as I have also. And for us, this is beyond the pale. I honestly thought it'd be beyond the pale when he was openly insulting John McCain on stage, but this is unhonorable.
And going after a Gold Star family.
All of our... Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But this is... I know President Bush did the same thing to the Kurds, but I think Trump did it with a bit more Trumpian style.
Yeah. Well, every single Republican president since Richard Nixon has betrayed the Kurds at least once. But this is more than just a betrayal. This is saying to them, walk this way into the meat grinder. It's just this is just mind-boggling. So bottom line here, Kurt, you're a veteran. You were a GI, and you're talking to your friends who are vets or who are active duty, who have also served with and fought beside the Kurds. And you guys are all basically horrified by this. Do you think that's a feeling that is broadly felt across the military, or is that just Democrats who are military?
Absolutely broadly. One of my ex-first sergeants and I have talked about it, and he was hardcore Trump, but he can't stomach this. And I never thought he'd say this, but he said this is beyond the pale. He fought in northern Iraq in the, well, not the first Gulf War, but the second Gulf War. He knows these people. And when you serve with someone, it's a totally different connection. And to betray these people like this it's demoralizing, it's unhonorable, it's disgusting.
Yeah, I'm with you. Kurt, thank you for sharing your story with us.
But also, as far as him calling out China to help him with the election this time, my neighbor in China said, I don't think he wants our government speaking about him. We know a lot more about him than Joe Biden.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. Kurt, thank you very much. Chuck in Lafayette, Louisiana. Hey, Chuck, what's up?
Hi there, Tom.
Hey.
Tom, I want to switch to a little bit later here. I was thinking about the GS people and how they could respond, and I'm thinking that they could write back and saying, Mr. President, we want to save on some jet fuel, and we don't want to overtax your little club. So we'd like to meet at the UN and next June, and that would free you up to meet with Vlad at your club.
Okay, so this is your response to Trump saying that the G7 this year is going to meet in Miami at my failing golf course. It's really pretty breathtaking. Chuck, thanks. That's a good one. Tom in St. Louis. Hey, Tom, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, I'm a huge fan. Thank you for uncovering so many issues that I wouldn't ordinarily hear about. I'm with you on the situation with the Kurds, but I was listening to the Mulvaney press briefing, and it's just astonishing, his arrogance, and I think it's hiding in plain sight. Again, normalizing this lawlessness.
Oh, that's been Donald Trump's strategy his entire life. It's what he was bragging to Billy Bush about. Just walk up and grab him. They let you do that when you're a star. I mean, this is he has gotten away. He's gotten away with tax fraud. It's how he got $400 million out of his daddy's estate, him and his sister. He's gotten away with refusing to pay his contractors. He's gotten away with hiring illegal labor. The Polish people who helped put together Trump Tower and then didn't get paid, and Trump said, tough luck. You guys aren't even here legally. I'm not going to pay you. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And literally everything he has ever done in his entire life that was crooked, which appears to be most of the things he's done, he's gotten away with. So he's now in a position where he's figuring, hey, I can get away with this. This is how it works. You brag about it.
Yeah. One thing I just read about today, I don't know if have you seen the Moody Analytic poll?
No.
It predicts Trump winning in a landslide in 2020.
Based on what?
Based on the economic conditions, if they remain the same.
Oh, I read an article about that yesterday in the Financial Times. Yeah.
But you have to consider the fact that they also predicted Hillary would win in 2016. So.
Right. Yeah, I'm a little skeptical here, but I'm not ready to panic, Tom. I'm ready to panic.
I'm sick of polls, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, me too. I just, everybody make sure that and Tom, thank you for the call. Everybody make sure that your voter registration is intact, that, particularly if you live in a state where the Secretary of State's office is controlled by a Republican. If you live in a heavily Democratic area, odds are they've kicked you off the voting rolls. Be sure that you're there.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archive.
Because right now, basically, the only thing standing between us and the end of the American experiment is the election of 2020. And welcome back, Bob in Testonia, Idaho. Hey, Bob, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Tetonia, Idaho, which is right on the Idaho-Wyoming border.
Okay.
And just below Yellowstone National Park.
Oh, it sounds like beautiful country, Bob. So what'd you call about?
6,200 feet. Follow the money, Tom. So I got thinking about contributions, and many times you have mentioned a PAC and a super PAC, and then nonprofit corporations that are designated by the IRS to be primarily for social purposes.
Right.
Now, they seem to be able to make political contributions now. And what is the difference between a PAC and a super PAC?
They're different pieces of the federal tax law, basically. Super PACs are less regulated. Super PACs were invented as a way to get around, when PACs came up. First of all, Congress tried to regulate individual contributions and corporate contributions. The Supreme Court blew that up. So Congress then came along and said, okay, well, we're going to regulate groups that are pulled together to pull together money on behalf of people, fundraising committees, they were called back in the day, and also known as political action committees. And so Congress then regulated those. And so then some slick lawyers got together and said, okay, we're going to do super PACs. They found another loophole, and Congress has not yet regulated super PACs, probably because most members of Congress have a super PAC.
Why has the contributions to the GOP political campaigns increased at such a dramatic rate here? Now, the money raised by Trump is considerable.
Yeah, it is. He's raising more than the Democrats. It's because if Trump raises $1 billion, that's less money than a number of people, who are his peers in the billionaire class got in tax breaks last year. I mean, you've got companies that are, the tax breaks. We're talking $1.5 trillion in tax cuts in the last 2 years. That's $1,500 billion in tax cuts. So if these guys just take, 1% or less than 1% of the tax cut they got and give it to Donald Trump as a thank you gift, that's $1 billion. Or more than $1 billion. It would be $1.5 billion. So, you ask, why is it that the Republicans are raising money hand over fist and the Democrats are finding it a little harder too? Well, the Democrats' primary message is we want to do things for average working people, and we're going to raise taxes on rich people and corporations to pay for it. We're going to raise them back to where they were prior to Reagan's, coming into office, or at the very least prior to George W. Bush. That's not a message that resonates well with the billionaire class and the big corporations. The Republicans are saying, we'll continue to cut your taxes, and not only that, we'll give you a special bonus. If you want to build a factory that's going to pollute the air, dump poison into the waters, you want to make toys or products that are substandard, that's fine. We're going to deregulate all these things. We're going to deregulate the FDA. We're going to deregulate the EPA. We're going to deregulate our public lands. So you'll be making more profit as you poison the earth. And, those guys are like, okay, cool. Our money's going to the Republicans. And, the Democrats are left with asking average people for their contributions online. And, Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, between the two of them, pulling in more than $50 million in the last quarter. That's mind-boggling. But, it's not going to be enough to run an election campaign. So we'll see where it goes. Stick around. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has a... What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. You can check it out, get the whole thing. So check it out at thomhartmann.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Paul in Woodinville, Washington. Hey, Paul, what's up?
Okay, so Nick Mulvaney is the latest Trumpster to invoke one of the two clauses of the Constitution that are written in invisible ink. The first being, what are you going to do about it, and who's going to make me? I mean,
yeah, there you go.
Those are, and well, I wanted to talk about the Supreme Court, presidents who defy Supreme Court decisions. You've talked about them last week, but there's something that's a little bit, I have something to add about it. So the first one, let's take the easy one first, was when Lincoln supposedly defied the Rogers decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford. Well, he really didn't defy it. What he did is redefine it as a off. This applies to this case only, is what he said.
Right.
And I guess his official defiance would have been the Emancipation Proclamation, but the war had already started.
Right.
So that was kind of a moot point. The more the more misunderstood one is the Andrew Jackson case. The Trail of Tears, when the Cherokee were relocated to the Oklahoma Territory, really wasn't part of the Worcester versus Georgia. It grew out of that.
No, I know, and in fact, most of that happened actually after Jackson left the White House.
True, but what Jackson said, the Worcester versus, just to make it short, Worcester versus Georgia vacated a conviction of Samuel Worcester, who was he was a missionary and a supporter of native sovereignty. He had translated the Bible into Cherokee, and he lived on the Cherokee Nation lands there. And he was convicted under a Georgia law, a Georgia state law that said you had to have a license to be on native sovereign territory. And the Supreme Court, well, first Jackson pardoned Worcester and 11 others, or 10 others, but Worcester did not accept his pardon so that he could get this decision go to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court vacated the conviction because it said the state of Georgia had no authority to make this kind of a law. And so when Jackson said in his letter to his friend John Coffey, John Marshall's made his decision, let him enforce it, wasn't really defying anything because there was nothing to defy because the court had vacated a conviction and there was nothing for Jackson to do about it because Jackson had offered a pardon anyway. So it was a moot point. Okay. What I'm getting to is that in Nixon's case, John Sirica had ordered that he turn over the tapes, and Nixon took this to the Supreme Court, and when the Supreme Court ordered that he turn them over, he did. I think what we're at risk of is that this Supreme Court knows that Trump will defy the court, and I'm worried that they will simply rule in his favor to avoid the constitutional crisis. And the swing vote in the ruling will be John Roberts as to whether he wants his court to be, a kangaroo laughingstock. I think that's what we're headed for.
That's a sobering thought, Paul.
Well, you know who's stacked on his side? He's got Gorsuch, he's got Kavanaugh, Alito, and Thomas.
Right.
And they have hopefully that Ruth Ginsburg can hold out long enough to get this nightmare over. And the only swing vote will be John Roberts. And I think John Roberts has got to make a decision about what kind of court he wants to have.
And what kind of legacy he wants to have. And whether this Democratic Republic or this experiment of Democratic Republican governance is going to last. Paul, thanks for that. Thanks thanks for the enlightening conversation. Sandra in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. Hey, Sandra, what's up?
Hi, I just wanted to talk about today with Nick Mulvaney. Trump is abusing his power. That should be the whole point of the impeachment, is that he's abusing his power. But now they're bringing everything up just like they always do. In other words, it's okay, so what? And Giuliani is a lawyer, so Giuliani, he knows a lot. So I'm so afraid now that this is not going to go anywhere again. It's so frustrating.
Well, Sandra, the number for your member of Congress is 202-225-3121. It gets you the main switchboard at the Capitol building, and you can ask for either of your two senators or your member of the House of Representatives. And as a starting point, I encourage you to contact all three of them and say, we need to impeach this guy and we need to impeach him now. And then beyond that, of course, make sure that you're registered to vote and make a personal commitment. That for some people, of waking other people up. Whether it's introducing them to good progressive media, or whether it's simply lobbying them one-on-one, or whether it's turning them on to great progressive websites, whatever it may be. I'm going to bring in one person a week, or I'm going to bring in 3 people a week. I'm going to become an evangelist. I'm going to actually spread the word. We all need to be doing those kinds of things. Sandra, thanks so much for the call. I share your outrage. Karen in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Hey, Karen, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I just wanted to tell you, I use this website. It's called vote.org, which is really simple. And on there, you can check your registration, register to vote, get an absentee ballot. They give you a number for an election protection hotline, and it's just vote.org. And I live across the street from a college, and I went over with little pieces of paper, vote.org. I got 27 kids to register to vote.
Yeah, I'm looking at the website right now. It looks like a pretty cool website. Premium tools, shop vote.org. So they've got a business model that's not toxic. It looks like. So
no, it's very simple, and it's very easy to use. I check my registration all the time, and they also give you a place where you can put your cell phone number if you want to get text messages reminding you election days are coming up.
Great.
Make sure you check your voter registration. So you can live anywhere in the country, put in your information, and you can check your voter registration.
That's great. Thank you for that, Karen. Thank you very much. I appreciate the call. David in Shelton, Washington, listening on KMAS. David, we have less than a half a minute. You had a quick one? A quick question?
Tom, would it open up any new powers if these guys were all prosecuted, Kavanaugh and Trump and everybody, under the RICO Act?
The problem is that the Office of Legal Counsel, the Office of the Attorney General of the United States, decided during the Nixon era and then reaffirmed during the Clinton era, 2 presidents who were in the process of being impeached, that you can't prosecute a sitting president because what he's doing is so important and he's so busy. Now we've got a sitting president who's playing golf all the time, but still they won't prosecute. So, David, I would love to see a RICO prosecution, but it's not going to happen until he leaves office. Thanks so much for being with us today. Hey, don't forget, democracy doesn't happen accidentally. It's something you got to get out there, get active, and wake people up. Tell people about our program and other programs. Get out there, get active, tag You're It. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
We say fight back!
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.